Chapter 992. Bang! The moment the bell was crushed, Aisha, who had been expressionless, suddenly stamped her feet and flew out like an arrow. She did not rush to Dean but flew in the opposite direction at full speed without looking back. Go. Anyway, live. Dean looked at her figure slowly shrinking in his sight. The tenderness in his eyes was gradually replaced by pain. He did not expect that in the end. He could only stop here after struggling for a lifetime. There were no miracles, no luck. Among all living beings, who had been blessed by God. Whoosh! Aisha's figure gradually became so small that it was difficult to see clearly. He could only faintly see the pioneers flying away along the way. The power of the abyss level was revealed at this moment. Even if she did not enter the demonic body, no one could stop her. It's finally over. We are all free, we are all free. Dean was lying on the ground, looking at the blue sky above his head. The suppressed tiredness in his heart surged like a tide. The slightly erect hair reminded him that danger would come again, but he had no strength to avoid it. He did not even want to hide anymore. Whoosh! A white light suddenly shot out. With a bang, the blazing light beam illuminated the street and shrouded it. The dust quickly dissipated in the light, turning into powder and annihilating into the smallest matter. Bastard! Above the palace, the excited people were now full of anger. They did not have the slightest excitement of annihilating the enemy. They saw that the turrets on both sides of the palace steps were slightly tilted at this moment. The silver-armored warriors under the turrets had fallen into a pool of blood. Standing next to their bodies were two tall and burly young figures. One was a handsome blonde youth with a noble label. The other was slightly younger, seemed to be about 23 or 24 years old. He had short brown hair and a burly figure like a bear. He looked very ordinary, but with thick eyebrows and big eyes, he had a majestic aura. Traitors! How dare you betray the Divine Lady? Kill them! These lowly people of the original wall should not have been left. Kill them! The people around the Divine Lady were so angry that their faces were somewhat distorted. They were so angry that their bodies were trembling. They were ready to welcome the victory and cheer. However, at the critical moment, two insignificant characters among them, who had always been silent and inconspicuous, actually rushed out and pushed the cannons in an attempt to stop their attack. If they succeeded, it would be equivalent to giving that abyss creature a chance to live. That would be their doomsday. Fear and anger. Everyone roared, and without waiting for the goddess's orders, they all activated their demonic bodies and rushed towards the two people beside the battery, wanting to tear them apart. The two of them looked at each other and activated their demonic bodies at the same time. They were like limpid autumn waters, but also like the cold ice of the extreme north. Her tone was calm, but it carried the majesty of a superior. After that, she turned her head, and her body swooped down like a flaming meteor. Boom! The closed door of the palace was suddenly dented, and a hole was broken. This towering palace door was actually made of heavy metal, but at this moment there was a very deep arc in the dent, and the edge of the crack was scorched black, and even the metal seemed to show signs of melting. She's not dead. The two people slowly came to their senses, but they were still quite shocked. With such a big hole in her chest, where her heart had been turned to ashes, she was still alive? She was simply a monster. However, the two people's attention quickly returned to another place, and their eyes quickly looked at the blurry projection in the air, only to see that the divine light wave had disappeared, and the target of the attack had already dispersed, and they saw a bottomless hole in the ground. At the edge of the hole, less than a few centimeters away, a figure was lying, eyes closed, motionless. It missed. Seeing this scene, the two people were extremely surprised, and they were so excited that they wanted to hug each other. But soon, the blonde youth quickly said, "Let's go quickly, the energy wave seems to have swept him. He's unconscious, and we can't let others get close." "Yes. Young master, we're coming." Trembling with excitement, the two people entered the demon body, jumped down from the palace and rushed quickly. Although the area of Royal City was large and could accommodate tens of millions of people, with the speed of the two people, if they walked in a straight line, they arrived at Dean's side in less than half an hour. They saw that the scene was already full of people, and many residents living nearby also came to see the excitement. When they saw that the destroyed building was only a few streets away from their homes, they could not help but secretly rejoice. The two people pushed the surrounding crowd, and forced their way in, only to see a team of pioneers had formed a phalanx, surrounding Dean inside, and around them were frontiersman-level warriors coming to clean up the scene and disperse the crowd. The two people looked at each other, slightly gritted their teeth, and suddenly rushed out of the crowd. Who? The captain of the pioneers was shocked to see the figure suddenly jumping out. This invasion was unforgettable for him, and he thought that the enemy had other accomplices. When he saw the face and dress of the newcomer, the hostility on his face quickly disappeared, and he put on a smile. It turns out to be the two masters you are? The goddess wants him, give him to us, the blond youth said coldly. The captain of the pioneers did not doubt him, and said with a smile, "We are going to give it to the goddess, but we are afraid to wake him up, so we dare not touch him. He has been dealt with. Tell the crowd to disperse, and you also disperse, and return to your respective posts," the blond youth ordered. "Yes, master." The captain of the pioneers nodded respectfully. Anyway, if the thing was handed over to the other side, even if there was a problem, it was none of his business. He also did not dare to stay with a terrible existence who dared to invade Royal City. Although the latter seemed unconscious at the moment, who knew when he would wake up? Maybe in the next second. The pioneers separated, and the two people stepped forward, looking at the familiar face on the ground, a burst of heat in their eyes, and slightly clenched their fists. The blond youth bent down to carry the body, turned around, and left. The brown-haired youth followed him, and the two people pushed the crowd and quickly left. Half an hour later, the two people took a detour out of Royal City, and came to the wilderness. To the dark fortress. The blond youth said, aimed in a direction, and rushed in a straight line at full speed. It didn't take long for the two to come to the Earl's city, and with the badge on their armor, they rushed all the way. The soldiers guarding the gate avoided far away, and didn't dare to block the way. After the two left, they enviously looked at their backs. It didn't take long for the two to come to a manor in the city. After entering, the owner of the manor, who was a noble, immediately came forward to greet them. "Hey, this is?" The owner of the manor saw the blond youth carrying Dean, and was a little surprised and puzzled. He felt that he had seen Dean before. The two ignored him, and quickly entered the manor. It seemed that they were the owner of this place, but in fact the word "seemed" could be removed. The two walked into a secret passage of the manor, and the owner of the manor slightly bowed, and put his hand on his chest, and respectfully sent them off with noble etiquette. At the end of the secret passage was a square, and there were many buildings, and the dome was full of bright chandeliers, all of which were emitting electricity, and were as bright as day. The two found a hall, and ordered all the people who were working inside to leave. At the moment, the consul who was on duty saw the two, and quickly ran over to greet them. "The best room, the best doctor, and don't let anyone disturb you." The blond youth stared at the consul and said quickly, "Yes, sir." Bang! A beam of light shot out. Dana, who was bathed in flames, slightly tilted her head, and the beam passed through her neck, and at the same time penetrated the dome of the hall behind her. "How is it possible?" The goddess was shocked, and looked at the silver gun in her hand. It wasn't an ordinary bullet gun, but a laser gun. In such an attack range, it was absolutely impossible to dodge. However, the person in front of her dodged it, and it was so easy. Laser gun technology is indeed much more advanced, but it's a pity that the development is a little abnormal, and other aspects are too close to primitive society. Dana turned her head back and stood in the air, looking down at the goddess and the old woman behind her. "Great goddess! How can you still be alive? The goddess gritted her teeth. She felt as if God was playing a joke on her. Her heart was pierced, but she was still alive. Wasn't this a deliberate attempt to kill her? You're Amelie, right? You're quite a ruthless girl. You even tried to kill your benefactor. Fortunately, those two little fellows were loyal enough to stop you in time. Otherwise, my experimental subjects would have been destroyed by you. Dana's expression was indifferent, but her tone was old. Tell me, what kind of death do you want? The goddess was Amelie. She stared at Dana. You can't blame me for this. Who told him to take you on a rampage? He wanted to occupy the giant wall. If he had come back quietly, I would have given him half of the ruling power. But he obviously wants to take everything away. This is the foundation of our tribe. We will never give it away. Ha ha! Dana gently smiled. Frog at the bottom of the well, you are satisfied with just one person. Pathetic human. Her body slowly floated towards Amelie. Whoosh, whoosh. Amelie quickly pulled the trigger and several lasers were shot out. Dana's body slightly swayed as the lasers flew past the edge of her body. The heat was like a dagger cutting her body. But she was bathed in flames, so she didn't care about the burning sensation. How is this possible? Amelie's pupils dilated. Her face was full of shock. She continued to pull the trigger. However, all the lasers missed. Whoosh! Dana's body suddenly flashed and appeared next to Amelie. She raised her hand and grabbed Amelie's hand that was holding the gun. She smiled and said, "The gun is a good thing. Unfortunately, the person who uses it is too weak. It's so easy to predict the trajectory of the bullet. It's really shameful." Amelie's face suddenly turned ugly. She tried to struggle but couldn't get rid of Dana's hand. It was like an iron hoop that firmly locked her wrist. "Give it to me," Dana said with a smile. She slightly shook her wrist and Amelie's hand involuntarily loosened. She groaned in pain. The laser gun fell into Dana's hand. She appreciated it for a moment. Her mouth curved into a smile. Her fingers suddenly lengthened and pierced Amelie's forehead. "Stop!" An angry roar came from the side, and the hunchbacked high priest suddenly stood up. The wrinkled skin all over his body suddenly shrunk, recovering at a speed visible to the naked eye, turning from withered yellow to white and tender. His skin also slowly expanded, without wrinkles, so tender that water could almost be squeezed out. "It's not your turn yet." Dana's eyes were indifferent. She raised her hand and shot. Bang! Fate seems to be guiding me, giving me everything I need, haha. Experiment subject. Great Priest's face slightly changed. He suddenly remembered that she had described Dean as a test subject. "Are you the ruler of the kingdom of God?" "No, but I will soon be." Dana smiled. The flames gradually converged into her body, revealing her delicate and slender body. At this moment, the great priest suddenly saw that on her chest, the hole that had been penetrated by the divine light wave was now filled with dark purple wriggling limbs. They were like poisonous snakes intertwining with each other, twisting slightly. The scene was nauseating. You are not a human." The Grand Priest's pupils shrank as she screamed in horror. "I am God, the future God." Dana slightly raised her head. Her body slowly flew in front of the Grand Priest. She looked down at the Grand Priest. She slowly stretched out her slender hand and pressed on the Grand Priest's forehead. The Grand Priest wanted to resist, but her body was shrouded by a kind of aura. It seemed that as long as she moved, she would face a thunderous attack. Dana's fingers quickly turned into sharp thorns and pierced into the Grand Priest's forehead. The Grand Priest's eyes were flickering, but her body suddenly stiffened. She slowly closed her eyes. After a long time, Dana slightly gasped for breath. It seemed that she had experienced a bitter battle. After adjusting for a moment, she exhaled lightly and looked at the Grand Priest, who still had his eyes closed. Her eyes showed a bit of disgust and excitement. "Interesting body, interesting idea, so interesting, I hope you can bring me a surprise." Young master! Young master! Someone called out in the darkness. Who is it? Dean slowly opened his eyes. His vision changed from fuzzy to clear. He saw several faces close to him in the dim light. Their faces were full of tension, concern, and surprise. He felt that his brain was a little mushy. His brain paused for a few seconds before he slowly reacted. He recognized these familiar faces and couldn't help but slightly widen his eyes. Is it you? Dean felt like he was dreaming, but his physical discomfort reminded him that he wasn't dead. It's us, young master. You finally woke up. Young master, we have been waiting for you to come back. They looked at Dean in excitement. It seemed that they had a lot of words to say. Noyce, Barton, Mason, Zack, Aurora. Dean looked at the faces. He felt his blood warm up. It was as if he had come to the desert from the North Pole. His mind slowly calmed down. Where am I? Wasn't I hit by that thing before? He knew the power of that thing. There was only one possibility that he was still alive, and that was that the thing had missed its mark. Young master, this is the Dark Fortress. It's our territory. The blonde Noyce said with a silly smile on his face. When the third divine light wave was fired, Barton and I hit the cannon barrel. The direction was a bit off, so it was shot askew. Dean was puzzled. Magic wave? Where did this thing come from? Why are you there? It's the secret weapon of the palace. It was made by the invaders. Noyce was the most eloquent of them all. He quickly said, Barton and I were there. We are counselors of the royal palace. We were ready to stop the first wave of divine light, but the others were watching with rapt attention. It was very difficult for us to catch them off guard. As a result, you were almost in danger. I deserve to die 10,000 times over. He bowed his head and knelt down. Barton, who was next to him, also knelt down. Mason, Zack, and Aurora, who were standing on the other side, were embarrassed. They wanted to say something but held back. Dean saw that Mason and Zack didn't seem to be as casual as they used to be. The relationship between them seemed to be a bit strange. He couldn't help but feel regret. Get up. I said that you don't need to kneel to anyone. Dean helped Noyce up. They didn't resist as they knew that Dean didn't like to play. You are the counselors of the palace. What's going on? Dean asked curiously. Noyce was relieved as he heard that there was no blame in Dean's tone. He slowly told the story to Dean. So that's how it is. Dean gradually understood what happened during this period of time. After he left, Noyce and others followed his instructions. They changed their household registration information and erased all traces. They took the resources he gave them and lurked around the giant wall. It didn't take long for the previous wall Lord Aristotle to return. The messenger of the kingdom of God came back with him. He rode a dragon and landed in the palace. The messenger didn't return on the same day but stayed in the palace. Aristotle was furious as he heard about the shocking changes in the giant wall. He massacred all the soldiers that Noyce had sent to stay in the palace. He liberated the suppressed nobles and searched for Dean and Noyce. He found many accomplices. For example, Pope Richelieu of the Outer Wall had been coerced by Dean. He was addicted to drugs and no longer had the bearing of a pope. He had become a skinny old man with no temperament. He was caught in a pub selling marijuana. He was paraded through the streets of the 12 Earls and then executed. In addition to Pope Richelieu, many elders of the Dark Church, including Hawkeye, who had followed Dean, were caught and beheaded. Although they erased their identity information, they had a deep foundation, unlike Noyce and Barton, who had a shallow foundation and erased it cleanly. Hawkeye and the Pope have been in high positions for many years, and the number of people they have been in contact with is hundreds and thousands of times more than Noyce and the others. The more complicated the relationship network is, the harder it is to wipe it clean. Aristotle was trying to find the remnants of the rebels while he was rebuilding the order of the inner wall. All the major families and the Monster Research Institute were restored to their former status. In just half a month it seemed as if the whole world had turned upside down for the residents of the inner wall. There had been earth-shaking changes. But at this time a light came over the giant wall. The invaders who claimed to be the desolate race came out of a huge, majestic spaceship. The messenger of the kingdom of God was the first to bear the brunt. He rode a dragon but didn't say a few words before he was shot dead by the light outside the spaceship. Aristotle was frightened and tried to escape, but he was still caught. Then a new round of changes began. Noyce, Mason, Barton and others who were lucky enough to survive came out from the dark after the desolate race completely took control of the giant wall. They pretended to work for the desolate race. They wanted to get an official position. They wanted to grasp the internal intelligence of the desolate race and wait for Dean to come back. However, in the end, only the talkative Noyce and the honest Barton were able to get the position of counselors. But it was just a nominal position without any real power. Amelie was interested in them because they were very familiar with the circles of the inner wall. It was beneficial to help them completely master all the forces within the giant wall as soon as possible. "Is this your secret gathering place?" Dean looked at the place where he was lying. It was a dimly lit room with luxurious decorations. He chuckled. "You have stolen the light and dark division method used by the monastery to manage the outer wall." Barton laughed foolishly and said, "Young master, although this monastery is not strong, their method is still very effective." Dudian nodded. Even a 3-year-old child could speak the truth of the world. Even in the Shernluo Empire, perhaps there was a similar management system. Even if the method came from a small giant wall like Sylvia, it wouldn't seem inferior. Everything in the world was the same. "I haven't seen you for a long time. It seems that you have learned a lot." Dean could feel the changes in them. Although Barton looked as honest as before, but his mind had become more delicate and black-bellied. Noyce, on the other hand, was better at hiding his true thoughts. He became more shrewd. As for Mason and Zack, he thought that they were not familiar with each other. But after Noyce's observation, he found that it wasn't the case. They had become more mature and knew how to control interpersonal relationship. However, what made Dean gratified was that no matter how big the change was, their loyalty to him didn't change at all. This could be seen from the fact that Noyce and Barton risked their lives to open the cannon for him. If it weren't for them, he would have been dead by now. "How long have I been in a coma?" Dean asked. 2 days. Noyce smiled. Dean's heart tightened but soon relaxed. As long as he was alive, then Amelia's tribe would not be a problem. As long as he wasn't as arrogant as Dana. Even if he was a dominator, he would be able to regain control of the giant wall. Not to mention with his current strength, only the lightsaber could pose a threat to him. Of course, it wasn't ruled out that Amelia's tribe had prepared something else. This lightsaber shouldn't be an ordinary laser cannon. It has such a long range. Dean's eyes flashed. Such a weapon was suitable for long-range attacks, but it was weak in close range. Thinking of this, he could not help but smile. Although Dana had read his memories and knew about the existence of the laser cannon, she had not expected the Amelia tribe to have such a long-range laser weapon like the Divine Ray Wave in such a short period of time. Dana wouldn't be so arrogant if she knew about this. Moreover, the lightsaber was hidden deep. Dana had read the Dragon Pioneer's memory but didn't see it. Due to these factors, Dana had become cannon fodder for him. Dean couldn't help but laugh. He looked at Noyce. "What's the situation in the palace? Did they send people to kill you?" "No." Neos shook his head. "According to our scouts, your friend has captured the Divine Daughter and the High Priest. She has already taken away the ruling rights of the palace. However, during this period of time, she did not leave the palace. Instead, she went to the desolate race's forbidden grounds behind the palace. So I'm not too sure of the exact situation inside." After he finished, he suddenly found that Dean was stunned on the bed. "Master?" Dean slowly opened his eyes. "Who did you just say?" Chapter 994. Dina. Dean felt as if a bucket of cold water had been poured over his head. She didn't die? Master, is she your enemy? Noyce was aware of the problem. He and Barton were present at the time, so they knew how fierce the woman's strength was. If she was an enemy, then it would be a disaster. Dean was in a daze for a long time. He had experienced several great joys and sorrows in a short period of time. He had a feeling of collapse. However, his strong mind and endurance made him restrain himself. He wanted to roar in his heart, but his body was numb as he sat on the bed. He felt powerless at this moment. The joyous atmosphere in the room dropped to the ice valley. Barton, Mason, Aurora, and others looked at each other. They didn't expect to face a more terrifying enemy after escaping from Amelia tribe. It wasn't difficult to see from Dean's situation that the woman was stronger than him. Master, should we move immediately? With your strength you can survive even if you go to other giant wall. We are willing to follow you. Noyce recovered and immediately came up with a plan. Although he knew that Dean already had the answer in his heart. Dean was silent for a moment. He shook his head. I have nowhere to go. If what you said is true, then there are only 3 possibilities for her to stay in the palace for 2 days. The first is that she is seriously injured and needs to recuperate immediately. Second is that there is something in the palace that attracted her so that she can't take care of me. Third is that she knows my position. If I plan to escape, she will immediately appear. The first possibility is 30%, the second possibility is 10%, and the third possibility is the highest. Noyce and Barton were startled. Mason asked, How did she know your position? Dean looked up at him and said, She should have installed a tracking device in my body. I have been in a coma for the past 2 days, so she didn't come over. They looked at each other. They didn't expect Dean's situation to be so embarrassing. It was no different from a prisoner. No matter what, we should still give it a try, but don't hold too much hope. Dean put away the negative emotions in his heart and said, You can't be exposed. Continue to lurk according to your original trajectory. If I sacrifice myself, don't look for her for revenge. The only one who can defeat her besides herself is probably God. God? Noyce and Barton looked at each other. They didn't expect that woman to be so terrifying. Wasn't she invincible? If you can live longer and become stronger in the future, then do me a favor. Dean looked up and seriously looked at them. If I have a corpse, then help me preserve it. If you find Aisha in the future, then give my corpse to her. It is best to let her eat it. Their hearts trembled as they looked at him in a daze. When their eyes met Dudien's eyes, they found that the teenager who was in high spirits and had control of everything was now covered with wind and frost. The childishness on his face had long faded. His young face was very mature. In the blink of an eye, how much time had passed. The few of them were a bit absent-minded. Only now did they suddenly realize that time had rushed past their bodies, carving many traces on them. Dean, don't say that. No matter what danger there is, I will follow you. This is our agreement. Mason clenched his fists as he spoke in a loud voice. Master. Barton wanted to say something, but he choked. Although he had trained his eloquence over the years, but he seemed to have returned to his original nature as he stood in front of Dean. He became honest and upright like when he was in the orphanage. Dean shook his head and smiled. This is the worst-case scenario. I can't escape, but you still have your life. Unfortunately, you won't be able to live a happy life with me for a few days. You will have to live like a mouse that everyone wants to kill. Master, I would have died in prison if it wasn't for you. Noyce clenched his teeth. There were tears in his eyes. He rarely shed tears as he had only cried for women. But this time he felt extremely uncomfortable and sad. Barton was Dudien's childhood companion in the orphanage. Mason was Dudien's childhood friend. Barton was Dudien's childhood friend. Barton was Dudien's childhood friend. Barton was the one who followed Dudien for the longest time. Barton was the one who accompanied Dudien for the longest time. Moreover, He had accompanied Dean through the trials and tribulations of the prison. He had experienced the cautious struggle in the early days of the escape. Later he became Dean's assistant. He was more familiar with Dean than Mason and Barton. Such a tenacious and unyielding person under torture was now using a pleading tone to ask for their help. How helpless was this? I have helped you and you have helped me. We are equal. Let's not talk about the past. I would have died if it wasn't for you and Barton. Dean smiled and patted Noyce's shoulder. Noyce and Barton bit their teeth but didn't reply. Dean glanced at them. What about Gwyneth? Aurora grunted and said, She's already dead. Dead? Dean was startled. There was some regret in his heart. Noyce explained. Gwyneth insisted on returning to the magistrate after you left. She came from there and relied on her privileges to become the head of the magistrate. She was ready to rely on her authority to thoroughly investigate the rats in the dark corners of the inner and outer wall. In the end, the nobles, the Monster Research Institute and other major forces had done some despicable deeds in secret. She killed a large number of nobles in anger. She provoked the wrath of the gods and the people inside the giant wall. It didn't take long for the former head of the wall to come back. She was ready to hide her identity, but no force could provide her shelter. Later an aristocrat pretended to protect her but secretly plotted against her. After her identity was exposed, she was beheaded by Aristotle and paraded through the streets for an entire week. It was only when her corpse started to stink that the parades were called off. Dean was startled as he didn't expect Gwyneth to end up in such a miserable state. However, there wasn't much anger on the faces of Noyce, Aurora, Macon and others. After thinking about it for a while, he understood. After all, the biggest underworld forces should be counted as their heads. If Gwyneth wants to pursue these underworld forces, it will inevitably cause friction with them, and they might even turn against each other. So in the end Gwyneth could only seek refuge under the nobles instead of relying on their strength. He sighed deeply. Gwyneth's appearance appeared in his mind. She had just come out of prison. She had followed him to battle. She had the courage to speak up. From a long time ago, Gwyneth had unabashedly expressed her disgust for some despicable act. She had been learning in the magistrate since she was a child. Her views would not change even if she was wronged and imprisoned. She was a good person. It's a pity, Dean murmured. The few of them remained silent. Dean retracted his thoughts after a moment of silence. He didn't mention about Gwyneth anymore. Is there a library here? Take me to see it. Are you going to read? Noyce was surprised. Macon, Barton and others were surprised. Shouldn't they seize the time to escape? Dean smiled. There is a golden house in the books. Noyce knew that Dean wouldn't do useless things, so he didn't ask much. Yes, I can take you there at any time if you recover. Then let's go now. 3 days later. A golden-armored desolate guard brought a letter to the dark fortress and passed it to Noyce. After reading it, Noyce's face suddenly changed. He took the letter and hurriedly went to the library in the depths of the dark fortress and found a young man who was sitting cross-legged under a bookshelf and flipping through a book. "Master, a letter from the palace," Noyce quickly called out. Dean lifted his eyes from the book and glanced at the letter in Noyce's hand. There was only one sentence in the letter. It was very simple. Have you played enough? Do you need me to personally invite you over? Dean's eyes were calm. He looked at Noyce. It seems that I don't need to escape to test whether she installed a tracking device on me or not. Noyce smiled bitterly. It seems that she has already grasped the Amelie tribe in the palace. With the help of the positioning device on you, she knows about our secret base. Otherwise, she wouldn't have sent the letter directly to you. That golden-armored desolate guard bluntly said that he would send it to you. Don't worry. She isn't interested in the power here. She will leave after the matter is settled. Dean stood up and patted the dust off his body. After she leaves, the desolate race will be hit hard. You can wait for an opportunity to attack. Prepare well during this period of time. If I'm still alive, I'll help you destroy the desolate race. Master. Noyce's eyes were full of worry. He didn't care about the secret base being exposed. Dean patted his shoulder. The messenger of the kingdom of God died here. The kingdom of God will send people to investigate. There are many strong people in the kingdom of God. The road to the throne is unattainable and too difficult. If you can take them to another place and find a giant wall, maybe they will be happier there. Noyce's nose turned sour as he heard Dean's words. Master, if something happens to you, then I'll avenge you. I'll use the rest of my life. Dean shook his head. It's not worth it. I don't want you to tie yourself to my prison after I rescue you from it. You have your own life. Find a village with few people and live a good life. Your Majesty Crimson Moon, the person you invited has arrived. A golden armor guard respectfully said. Above the palace hall, a slender figure wearing a scarlet flame robe sat on the throne, looking down from above. On both sides of the hall were the leaders of many forces, including the earls of the 12 cities, the deans of the Demonic Creature Research Institute, the patriarchs of the demonic hunter families, and so on. Bring him in. An indifferent voice came from the throne, covering the entire hall and reverberating in everyone's ears. Dean was standing outside the hall when he heard Dana's voice. He sighed in his heart and followed the golden-armored, desolate guard into the hall. Soon, he saw the patriarch of the Winged Demon clan, the patriarch of the Rock clan, the dean of the monastery, several outstanding academicians of the Monster Research Institute, and several nobles who had flattered him. On the two sides of the throne, Amelia and the great priest could be seen. Familiar faces. Dean chuckled, somewhat self-deprecating. Your Majesty Crimson Moon, Dean has arrived. The golden armor guard respectfully bowed his head. Dinah nodded slightly on the throne and said to Dean, Did you have a good time these days? How could I have a good time without you? Dean chuckled. Dinah raised her eyebrows and a cold light flashed in her eyes. She seemed to have thought of something and her lips curved. Is that so? I'll play with you later. Dean heard her deliberately ambiguous tone and knew that she was angry. He shrugged and said, I hope your skills haven't deteriorated in a few days. The smile on Dinah's face did not diminish. She suddenly realized that she had made a mistake. She was far from being his opponent when it came to flirting with a man. Although the conversation between the two was short, the people on both sides of the hall were surprised. Chapter 995. That's my name. Dana didn't look back. She said in an indifferent voice, I named it myself. You have to call me that in the future. Do you understand? Dean slightly curled his lips. Do you want to say goodbye to the past? Why is it called Crimson Moon? Is there any symbolic meaning? Don't confuse me with you mortals. You like to name things with blessings or future expectations. I just want to remember the day I was born. Dana indifferently said. Dean thought for a moment. I don't think there is a festival called Crimson Moon. It's not a festival. Dana walked to the corner of the corridor and glanced at Dudian. The night I was born, the crimson moon was in the sky and the stars were dim. Judging by your Chinese thinking, I am the crimson moon, the daughter of destiny. I am destined to shine like the crimson moon, and you are just the stars around me that you can't see. Dean was a little surprised, and then chuckled. As far as I know, the moon is white, or it can be said to be a silver moon, but to say the crimson moon, it is rare. Of course, it's not strange if I can see it every day. Only this kind of special celestial phenomenon is worthy of me. Dana contemptuously said. Dean faintly smiled but didn't discuss the name with her. He asked, Are the experimental materials ready? You should have gone to Amelia's spaceship after you conquered their tribe. What's the harvest? Don't you want to test it with other experimental subjects? Don't worry. I'll leave you to the end. Dana or Crimson Moon glanced at him as if to say that he didn't need to be afraid of death. Dean didn't care about her eyes and said, You have got the super chip. You haven't finished learning the things inside. It won't be too late to call me when you have finished learning. I don't want to bother you. You're honest. I thought you would be stupid and run away. Crimson Moon's face was indifferent. It's a pity that you let go of such a good experimental subject. Even if you don't use her for experiments, you can still cultivate her into a super fighter. She is the crystallization of the Witcher's experimental subject. Moreover, she has eaten the flesh and blood of the origami. Her potential is much more terrifying than you think. I think she can reach the level of the king just by eating. Dean was startled. He didn't expect this. He couldn't help but say, it's not that exaggerated. Even if undeads rely on eating to evolve, there should be a limit. How much food does she have to eat to reach the king level? Who knows? In any case, this land lacks everything, but it doesn't lack people or monsters. Crimson Moon pushed open the door to the back of the palace and said as she walked, but it's fine even if she eats until she becomes a king. The ones who should have a headache are those fellows in the Empire. Once our experiment is complete, it will be very easy to find her. I don't believe that she can climb over the War God wall. Dean was shocked. Indeed, if Aisha ran all the way to the War God wall, relying on the bloodthirsty nature of the undeads, she would inevitably rush up and slaughter, and then the king of the Empire would be alarmed to suppress her. Thinking of this, his heart was a little nervous. Crimson Moon seemed to see through Dean's thoughts. She sneered. Think about yourself. You can't even protect yourself. It's ridiculous to think so much. Dean glanced at her coldly. Suddenly, he thought of something. His eyes glanced at her chest, which was still round and plump. Under the cloak was a scarlet tight armor, which made her petite and graceful figure very tempting. He raised his eyebrows. I remember that your heart was pierced by that thing at that time. You didn't die? He spoke very straightforwardly. Crimson Moon glanced at him indifferently. I'm sorry to disappoint you. For me, the heart is no longer a fatal organ. This isn't some special ability. If you want, I can modify you a little so that you can also obtain this kind of immortality. How about it? When he learned that she was not dead, Dean thought of this, but he didn't expect it to be true. So, the only fatal organ left was her brain? Or, even if her brain was cut off, it might not be able to kill her? If there's a chance in the future, I'll dismember her body and burn her to ashes with fire. That's the safest way. Dean thought secretly. Crimson Moon glanced at him. Her eyes seemed to be looking directly into the depths of his heart. There was a kind of breathtaking insight. She beckoned a teenager from the side and said, "Take him to do a physical examination." The back hall had been transformed into a laboratory. It was filled with advanced tools used by alchemists of the life school. Many masked figures were busy in front of various instruments. They looked to be in their 50s or 60s. Some of them had gray hair, and some of them had white hair. The boy was the youngest among them. Apart from him, the other 3 middle-aged men were the youngest. When the teenager saw Dean, he was a little shocked, especially when he saw that Dean's legs below the knees were all broken, and he only walked with the demonized blades extending from his knees. His eyes widened even more. "What? Haven't you seen a disabled person before?" Dean smiled at the teenager. The shock on the teenager's face quickly disappeared. He glanced at Crimson Moon, who was frowning at him, and hurriedly bowed his head to apologize. Then he helped Dean to another instrument and let Dean lie down for a physical examination. "From today on, you'll live here. You can't leave without my order. Everything you eat and drink can only be provided by me. You're not allowed to eat any other food. Do you understand?" Crimson Moon came over and ordered Dean, who was lying on the examination bed. Dean finally knew why she called him over so early. It was to observe the changes in his body index in advance. He nodded and said, "Got it." Crimson Moon turned and left. After saying a few words to the others, she went to a separate small room in the depths of the rear hall. Dean glanced at her with his X-ray vision and saw her sitting in the small room, taking out the super chip and the screen board to study. I'm going to draw your blood and test your magic mark. Please take off your clothes. The teenager bowed his head and said very politely. Dean took a deep look at him. He didn't answer. He directly raised his hand and tore off his clothes. He lay naked on the examination bed and closed his eyes. Chapter 996. Blood Test. Fat percentage covering 12%. Magic Mark Activity Test. Dean lay down and let the youth test his body. He closed his eyes and thought about his own things. When all the required specimens were collected, the youth helped Dean up and said nervously, "You can go to the side and rest for a while." Dean looked at him and asked, "What's your name?" The youth's face changed slightly. He bowed his head and said, "My name is Sangba." Sangba. Dean muttered and nodded slightly. He got up from the bed and condensed a magic blade on his severed knee. He stood on the ground and pierced the floor, creating a crack. He walked toward the rest area on the other side of the back hall. At lunchtime, a maidservant brought over a medium-well steak and a cup of milk. After eating, Dean lay on the sofa and continued to rest with his eyes closed. Fei Yu stayed in the small room, concentrating on learning the knowledge in the superchip. Other masters transferred from the monastery and the Monster Research Institute were busy with the experimental tasks given to them by Fei Yu. In the afternoon, Dean saw 3 ragged girls, who looked 7 or 8 years old, being led to the back hall by a golden-armored wilderness guard. "Sir, the experimental subjects you wanted are here," the golden-armored wilderness guard said respectfully. An old man wearing a white coat and a monocle came forward and soon frowned. He pinched his nose and said, "It stinks. Where did you find them?" "From the slums. They don't have household registration," the golden-armored wilderness guard said respectfully. The old man frowned and waved his hand. "Take them out to wash. Don't send such dirty things here in the future. Don't stain this place." The golden-armored desolate guard jumped in fright and hurriedly said, "Yes, I'll take them to wash up." With that said, he grabbed the 3 girls who were looking around in confusion and quickly left the rear hall. Dean, who was lying on the sofa not far away, opened his eyes and watched the scene. After the golden-armored desolate guard left, the old man seemed to be aware of something. He tilted his head and looked at Dean. When their eyes met, the old man's mouth revealed a rich smile. He licked his lips, like a hungry prey appreciating a delicious dinner. Dean closed his eyes and ignored it. At night, the 3 clean little girls were sent into the hall. The old man wearing a monocle led them to a separate laboratory room. Not long after, the little girls' screams and cries could be heard from inside. The voice came abruptly and ended abruptly. Dean slightly frowned, turned around and continued to close his eyes. "You are quite honest. Why didn't you go out for a stroll today?" Crimson Moon came to Dean's side and said with a smile. Dean opened one eye and glanced at her. "Have you finished?" Crimson Moon stretched lazily, revealing the slender figure of a lovely young girl. "I'm tired from watching, so let's take a break. The people of the old era really do have some redeeming qualities. Perhaps in the future we will be able to create nuclear weapons, conquer the Earth, and reclaim the absolute ruling position of the human race." Dean was too lazy to talk. These things were too far away for him. Crimson Moon's eyes sparkled. She was full of confidence for the future. Seeing that Dean ignored her, she didn't say anything more. Humming a classic song from the old era, she turned around and left. The next day, Dean's first physical examination report came out. The report was sent directly to the desk in Crimson Moon's small room. Dean didn't have a chance to look at it. Instead, he cooperated with Sangba and continued the second specimen collection. Time flew. Dean had been in the back hall for half a month. Every day, he had to complete a specimen collection. Every day, the changes in his body data would be sent to Crimson Moon. He was just like a lab rat in a cage being injected. In this half a month, the golden-armored desolate guard had sent some experimental subjects, one after another. Most of them were untouchables from slums without household registration. Even if they died, no one would know, so it was not easy to be investigated. Occasionally, some strong hunters would be sent. The first 3 little girls who were sent here turned into a pile of strange meat on the 3rd day and were dragged out. Their heads were wrapped in the strange meat. They were like dry corpses, screaming as if they were in deep despair. Dean silently watched as batches of experimental products were sent to him. They were turned into piles of failed materials and sent out. For the first time, he clearly felt the horror of the Monster Research Institute. They had been doing such experiments in secret for many years. Life was only a string of data here. There was no additional meaning besides that. It seems that the small intestine of the origami that Bolo had implanted into your body has begun to work. Crimson Moon called Dean to her small room office. In her hand was a stack of 4A paper that recorded the experimental data of Dean's body. She looked up at Dean and said with interest, "Do you feel that the food you ate these days tastes strange?" Dean knew that he was now a lab rat being interrogated. He didn't struggle and said, "I feel that the taste is a bit disgusting." Crimson Moon smiled gently and said, "I can give you a delicious dinner later." Dean didn't care about eating and drinking. He frowned and said, "When are you going to do the experiment for me? What's the hurry?" "I'm not in a hurry." Crimson Moon chuckled and said, "Let's observe for a few months first. We can also experiment with other experimental materials. Amelia's tribe has a lot of ice worms. It's enough to strengthen these experimental materials." Dean's face darkened slightly, but he didn't speak. Crimson Moon saw that he was in a bad mood, so she didn't joke with him anymore. She waved her hand and let him leave. Then she took out the super chip and continued to study. In the evening, Dean saw the delicious that Crimson Moon mentioned. It was a bloody raw steak. He frowned at the first sight, but the next moment, he suddenly found that the fresh blood on the steak looked as tempting as the butter beside the cooked steak. He couldn't help but salivate. The smell of blood wafting from the steak made him feel an indescribable urge, and his appetite was greatly stimulated. He sat down at the dining table and stared at the smell of blood wafting from his plate, causing his nose to itch. He swallowed a mouthful of saliva and thought of Crimson Moon's words. His heart trembled. Is this the change brought about by the origami's small intestine? Does it mean that the origami eat raw meat? Dean shuddered when he thought of the beautiful origami tearing the raw meat with its mouth. After hesitating for a moment, Dean finally raised the knife and fork, cut the raw steak into pieces and ate them. He felt that every piece was delicious. The feeling of blood squeezing out of the beef made him intoxicated. After eating, Dean wiped the blood from the corner of his mouth. He looked at the empty plate and sighed. What would he become? The old men in white coats were not so lucky. Although they had been researching and experimenting all year round, their physiques were not that strong. Moreover, it happened so suddenly. They were instantly splashed with dark green blood. One by one, they screamed and wailed in agony. They covered their faces and rolled on the ground, knocking over the surgical carts around them. Various types of scalpels, forceps, vices, and other tools for different needs were scattered on the ground. Whoosh! As the dark green blood splashed out, a few strange dark green limbs suddenly sprang out of the square-faced young man's abdomen. They looked like arthropods with sharp barbs on them. As they wriggled, they struck another old man in a white coat who was slightly closer. The barbs hooked onto the old man's waist and sent him flying. Crimson Moon frowned slightly as a cold light flashed in front of her eyes. She didn't even make a move, but a streak of silver light swept past several of the monstrous limbs, causing them to fall to the ground. Dark green blood flowed out of them and corroded the metal floor, leaving behind potholes. Squeak, squeak. A sharp cry came from the square-faced young man's abdomen. A bloody head the size of a fist protruded from inside. It had a tortoise-like shell on top of its head and a single eye. Its facial structure looked like a human's face with a nose and lips arranged under the eye. It had no eyebrows, a sharp nose, and a huge mouth. The corners of the mouth were split all the way to the ears, revealing sharp teeth as it screamed. This thing quickly noticed Crimson Moon in front of it and immediately rushed towards her. Crimson Moon frowned slightly. A metal can had appeared in her hand out of nowhere. As the little thing leaped out, she swung her hand and with a bang, the metal can was quickly sealed. Bang! Bang! The little monster's strength was so great that the metal can bulged slightly as if it would break out at any time. Crimson Moon stared at it and saw that it struggled for a moment inside the metal can. After a few minutes, it gradually weakened and became calm again. "It's dead." Dean breathed a sigh of relief. Crimson Moon frowned and twisted the metal can open. Whoosh! Suddenly, a bloody shadow flashed and jumped out of the can like a monkey, pouncing on Crimson Moon's face. Crimson Moon quickly raised her hand, pinched it, and stuffed it back into the metal can. She sealed it again, and then placed it in a groove on another experiment table that was embedded in the ground. The metal can was just right in the groove. No matter how hard it struggled, the metal can did not move. Crimson Moon looked at the old men in white coats who were rolling on the ground and moaning. Her expression was as indifferent as ever. She said, "All of you get out. Clean your bodies and receive treatment." Her words seemed to have a kind of magic power, causing the screaming old men in white coats to stop struggling. They were sweating profusely. Gritting their teeth, they covered their festering faces and turned to leave the laboratory. "How could it fail? Kern, are you okay? Quick, I'll take you to the treatment room." Several old men who were waiting next to them immediately greeted them and took the injured old men away. Only Crimson Moon and the little monster in the metal can were left in the laboratory. The square-faced young man seemed to be dead. His body was not moving at all. Dean used his X-ray vision to look at him and saw that the heat source in his body was quickly dissipating. Many of the blood vessels in his body had actually shrunk and were wrinkled as if they were dried. The magic marks on his left shoulder and chest had long disappeared. After looking for a moment, Dean roughly guessed the origin of the little monster. It should be the magic marks in his body. Too many active origami cells were injected, causing it to engulf his own body. Instead, it used his body as an ovary and the magic marks inside as a tonic to give birth to a new life. Dean's eyes were full of dignity. Creating life, since ancient times, this was the ability and power of God. However, at this moment, Crimson Moon did it. She touched the forbidden area that could only be seen but not reached. Although the experiment had failed, this alone was enough for him to be proud of. Suddenly, she was a little jealous of Aisha, who had turned into a corpse king. They were also the products of the experiment. Why could she get such love? However, this jealousy came and went quickly. She was too lazy to argue with an undead. When the experiment is successful, this world will be ours. Crimson Moon held Dudyen's cheek and looked at his handsome and delicate face. Thinking of all the things this man had experienced since he was a child, her heart pounded slightly. She said softly, "When we conquer the world, I will accompany you to the highest mountain to see the most beautiful sunset." Dean looked at her with the same gentleness. "We will all be immortal." Crimson Moon smiled slightly, and her mind could not help but recall their long and romantic life. She whispered, "No matter how many experiments I create in the future, you will be my one and only, irreplaceable." "You too." Dean looked at her affectionately. Crimson Moon's body was slightly hot under his gaze. She suddenly bowed her head, kissed his lips gently, and then retreated like a dragonfly skimming the water. When Dean came back to his senses, she was standing behind the desk, like an innocent young girl, with a touch of shyness on her face. "You go out first." Dean touched his lips in a daze. After a long time, he responded with a smile, got up and left the office. Before closing the door, he said with concern, "Don't stay up late. I will adjust my state to the best and help you complete your experiment. Crimson Moon gently nodded. After the door was closed, the blush on Crimson Moon's face slowly receded. She fell into contemplation. After a long time, she shook her head slightly and no longer thought about it. She continued to read the previous experimental materials. After Dean came out, he went to eat dinner and then returned to his sleeping place. It was already late. He looked at the stars in the sky and listened to the busy experimenters carrying out the final instrument tests tonight. The starlight was reflected on the windowsill. He looked at it quietly, a little lost in thought. Early the next morning, all the experimenters were present. The atmosphere in the entire back hall was obviously different than before. It was extraordinarily serious. All the experimenters were very solemn. When Dean got up, someone immediately took him to take a bath. After taking a bath, he put on a sterilized antibacterial suit and came to the largest laboratory in the back hall. Chapter 999. You're here. Crimson Moon came out of the laboratory. Today, she was wearing a pure white coat and a mask. Only her eyes exposed on the mask could let people feel her beauty. Dean's eyes lit up when he saw her, and his originally nervous body quickly relaxed. Are you ready? Crimson Moon looked at him tenderly, with a trace of tenderness in her eyes. Dean took a deep breath, and a confident smile appeared on his mouth, saying, I'm ready. I believe you can do it. Crimson Moon looked at him deeply. I will. The laboratory was very empty. There were not many instruments, but they were relatively complex. In the middle of the laboratory was a metal platform, surrounded by scanners, dialysis mirrors, and other equipment. Dean glanced at it and sighed in his heart. Although he had the knowledge in the superchip, it was not easy to make these things in a short time. However, this was also because of the rise in the overall industrial technology of Sylvia. In the 2 years he served as the Wall Lord, electricity had been popularized. Under the industrial development driven by electricity, the progress was very rapid, so that Crimson Moon had the capital to smelt the appropriate materials to make these things in a short time, and the manpower invested in it was estimated to be beyond his imagination. Under the guidance of Crimson Moon, Dean lay on the metal platform. Crimson Moon put on the mask again, her expression solemn. She looked at Dean and saw the trust in each other's eyes. Don't be nervous, come on. Dean comforted her softly. Crimson Moon nodded slightly, took a deep breath, and told the 5 old men around her who had followed her for many days, Get ready. The eyes of the 5 people flashed with excitement. They had been waiting for this day for several months. This was the moment to witness a great miracle, and they were the creators of the miracle. They had carried out the same experiment many times, and all the procedures and processes had long been memorized. It was just that today they had changed the subject, and this subject was the last and most precious experimental subject. There was no room for failure. Despite the excitement, the 5 people behaved more cautiously than before. Anesthesia. Bone knife. Crimson Moon untied the antibacterial suit on Dean's body, revealing his white and strong chest. Even if he was lying down, the outline of his six-pack could be seen. Dean did not deliberately pursue a perfect body, but after fighting for a long time, his body naturally became healthy and beautiful. The 5 old men acted as assistants and handed various scalpels to Crimson Moon. Anesthesia, cut open the belly, support with a stent, and move the internal organs. Crimson Moon's movements were skillful and her eyes were calm and focused. She was accustomed to the bloody scene in front of her. It didn't take long for her to complete the prelude to the operation and construct a new magic mark ovary inside Dean's body. Soul worm. Crimson Moon ordered. A white-robed old man immediately handed over a transparent jar that was used to seal a soul worm. Inside the jar was a curled-up soul worm that seemed to be in a bad mood. It looked like a scale and was rectangular in shape. Its body was almost transparent, with only a few flame-like red threads twining around its body. This was a soul worm brought from the eastern continent. In addition to the ability of the soul worm itself, it also had a flame attribute. However, if this soul worm was bred alone, the flame attribute it carried would basically be equivalent to nothing, and it would be classified as a recessive attribute. Only when it coexisted with the soul worm from the Shunluo Empire would the flame attribute become dominant, and conflict would arise. Dean felt that the parts below his neck had lost feeling, and the anesthesia was slowly extending to his brain. His thoughts were a little slow, and his head was dizzy from time to time. From time to time, his vision darkened due to insufficient blood supply. He glanced at the transparent scale-like soul worm from the corner of his eyes. He could see many fine whiskers on its body, like countless thin feet. He asked Crimson Moon about the origin of this soul worm. Sun Beast. The eastern continent gave the soul worm its name, not the word swordsman. This soul worm was taken from the body of the Sun Beast, and its main function was related to light and heat. According to Crimson Moon, the Sun Beast was an extremely rare monster. It was extremely strong, especially good at long-range attacks, but its close combat ability was also terrifying. It had almost no flaws, the only weakness was its fear of the dark. At night, the strength of the Sun Beast would plummet. Among the many soul worms of the eastern continent that Crimson Moon had collected, this Sun Beast soul worm was one of the best. Dean could see that Crimson Moon had held nothing back in this experiment. Although it was not a desperate attempt, she had done everything she could. Soon, the Sun Beast soul worm was sent into Dean's abdomen by Crimson Moon. As if smelling the blood, the listless soul worm suddenly recovered its vitality and quickly drilled into the magic mark ovary in Dean's abdomen. Soon, the blood vessels were agitated, and a large amount of blood gushed out like water, converging into the nest. Seeing that the artificially constructed nest had stabilized the soul worm, Crimson Moon was relieved. At this point, the experiment had basically succeeded by 1/3. God's blood, Crimson Moon said. An old man next to her quickly handed over a small bottle of black blood that was as thick as a finger. Crimson Moon inhaled it with a syringe and injected it into Dean's heart. Soon, the black blood flowed along the blood vessels into Dean's heart, dyeing the red heart black. Then, as the heart pumped, it quickly spread to the whole body. The color of all the blood vessels became dim, including Dean's lips. In an instant, the color gradually deepened and became black. Dean could not see the changes in his body, but he suddenly felt a swelling pain in his brain. His body felt extremely hot. He had been anesthetized and unconscious, but at this moment, he seemed to have regained control of his body. The huge heat made his scalp tingle, but soon, there was an extremely cold chill in this high temperature, starting from his right arm and quickly climbing all over his body, suppressing the heat. However, this hot feeling was not to be outdone and quickly rose again. The cold and the boiling heat quickly alternated. Dean felt that his brain was so swollen that he could not think, and his brain was aching. His vision was already dark, and he could not see anything. He felt as if his body had fallen into a dark vortex, constantly sinking. The raging god's blood seems to have flowed into his brain. An old man exclaimed in a low voice. He raised his hand to prop up Dean's closed eyes, but there was no reaction from his eyeballs. Crimson Moon was busy with Dean's abdomen. She did not raise her head and said, "Don't worry, the uranium ring on his neck can block the god's blood. The blood that flowed into his brain is just the mutated blood infected by the god's blood. It does not have the attack characteristic of self-devouring." The old man was relieved. At this moment, he heard Crimson Moon shout again, "No, quickly, prepare the cold crystals." They looked over and suddenly saw a strange scene. Half of Dean's body was frozen, and the other half was red like fire. Two different temperatures occupied half of Dean's body. In the middle of these two extreme temperatures, the skin had begun to fester. Under the battle of ice and fire, the cold and high temperature, the gene chain was close to collapse, and the body could not bear it. How could this be? They could not believe it, and their eyes widened. Although such a situation had occurred in their previous experiments, they had improved it and used God's blood to stabilize this state. Why did it fail now? At this time, Crimson Moon grabbed the cold crystal and quickly cut it open. She inhaled the cold liquid inside into a syringe and injected it into the hot left half of Dean's body. Soon, the temperature of the left half of Dean's body gradually decreased, but soon it became hot again, and it was even hotter than before. Crimson Moon's face was ugly. The magic marks don't match, and the Sun Beast soul worm wants to swallow the splitter. Damn it! She had previously encountered a situation where the soul worm did not match the experimental body's soul worm, but under the stability of the god's blood, the two were quickly suppressed. But this time the situation was obviously different. She suddenly realized that the previous situation could be suppressed by the god's blood because the previous experimental soul worms were too ordinary, and the Sun Beast soul worm and the Splitter soul worm were both top soul worms. Especially the Sun Beast soul worm, it was only slightly inferior to her Dream Breeder soul worm, but it was much stronger than the Splitter soul worm. Under normal circumstances, the Splitter soul worm did not have the power to fight at all and could not form a balance. But she knew that Dean's Splitter soul worm was a strengthened version of the soul worm that had swallowed its own kind, and it had also swallowed the origami factor. It belonged to the real deified and strengthened Splitter soul worm, and this deified characteristic was enough to make the Splitter even more extreme. According to the Empire's 5-star soul worm ranking system, the deified Splitter could be listed in the 5-star category. Although it could not be ranked in the top of the 5-star category, it could be regarded as one of the top soul worms. But she did not expect that under such circumstances, it still could not suppress the Sun Beast soul worm. Soon, Crimson Moon came to a realization. The Sun Beast soul worm was very likely to have absorbed the god's blood and completed its deification. Therefore, its quality, which was originally higher than the Splitter, was improved again. It was already one of the best among the 5-star soul worms. When it exceeded a person's critical point, the long period of low-temperature freezing would completely freeze a person's life. Even if they were lucky enough to wake up, their brain function would not recover completely. The possibility of them becoming an idiot or mentally retarded was as high as 90%. After all, the human brain was too mysterious. It contained consciousness, soul, and thoughts. These were all mysteries that scientists had not been able to solve until now. For example, why did humans dream? How did human consciousness come about? How did human thoughts come about? Where was the soul? These were all unsolvable mysteries. Dean's parents might have considered the possibility of Dean becoming an idiot, so they recorded most of the important knowledge of the old era, especially the industrial reform, in the form of text and pictures in the superchip. Even if Dean became an idiot, he might be able to rely on the knowledge in the chip to recover some intelligence. Even if he was too idiotic to learn, it didn't matter. If the chip fell into the hands of other survivors, it could also play a great role in rebuilding human civilization and restoring its brilliance. This was what Crimson Moon thought, and she felt that her guess was not far from the truth. This poor man thought that he had pinned all of his parents' hopes on him, but in fact, his parents only had a glimmer of hope for him. Their real intention was to keep the superchip, which was the most important thing. Let me see what effect a pure body that has not been exposed to radiation and nuclear residue from mutant creatures can play. Crimson Moon stared at the unconscious Dean, her eyes flashing with a strange light. At this time, the body temperature on both sides of Dean's body gradually approached the same, including Dean's frozen right arm. At this moment there were faint red lines in it. They were blood vessels, which exuded exuberant and hot blood, causing the whole ice arm to constantly emit steam. Check body temperature, 42 degrees. An old man who was observing the changes in Dean's body reported to Crimson Moon. Crimson Moon nodded slightly. Although 42 degrees was a high fever for humans, it was still within the range of tolerance for Dean. As time went by, Dean's body temperature became more and more stable, gradually dropping from 42 degrees to 40 degrees. However, at the same time, Dean's body suddenly showed new changes. Aging. His skin became drier and drier, and the flesh on his face gradually loosened. In the blink of an eye, he had changed from a handsome young man to a mature, middle-aged man with a weather-beaten face. Moreover, the aging continued, changing at a speed visible to the naked eye. Before long, he looked like a man in his 50s, his skin gradually wrinkled, and his sideburns were slightly white. The cells in his body are accelerating the fission. An old man could not help but look at Crimson Moon, waiting for her instructions. Crimson Moon slightly frowned. She did not expect that Dean would encounter all the negative symptoms they had encountered before. First, the imbalance of heat and cold almost caused his body to be torn apart, and now there was aging. Fortunately, she had encountered both of them before, and she had already found a solution. She immediately ordered, "Inject the nutrient solution and the divine serum of life." The origami factor and the magic mark in his body are competing with each other and devouring his body. Use these to resist first, and when his body stabilizes, he will recover. Several old men quickly followed her instructions. When Dean aged to more than 60 years old, the nutrient solution and the divine serum of life had been injected, and the aging speed quickly slowed down and gradually stabilized. Chapter 1001. Crimson Moon's eyes were cautious. This last step could not be tested before. Success or failure depended on Dean's own characteristic. She had transformed Dean's body into a body that matched the origami's heart, but whether it could be a perfect match or not depended on luck. Test the experimental body's condition. Crimson Moon ordered. Several old men immediately took out various instruments and started to work on Dean's body. After a while, all kinds of data were collected. Blood pressure stable, spirit stable, magic mark stable, God's blood dissolved stable. As Crimson Moon listened to the old men's report, her pupils faintly turned scarlet. The world in her eyes immediately changed, and she saw many things that she couldn't see before. Under the strange detection of her pupils, Dean's body gradually calmed down. The god's blood and the magic mark in his body formed a triangle, confronting each other and stabilizing. "Get ready." Crimson Moon took a deep breath and took out a scalpel. She slowly cut open Dean's chest. The tough skin was like a thin film in front of the special sharp scalpel. It was easily cut open. Her slender hands became agile at this moment. Dean's chest was quickly cut open layer by layer, including the ribs. She used the bone-cutting knife to cut open the ribs. The whole process was silent, like a piano master playing a great divine song. Dong dong. A red heart was beating in the chest under the ribs. It contracted, and the blood was flowing out. The red heart was originally a human, but now the edge was black. It was the infection of the god's blood. Crimson Moon paused, and then her fingers danced quickly. In an instant a shadow appeared. In the blink of an eye, the red heart in Dean's chest had fallen into her hands. It was still beating. A slight tremor came from her fingers. Crimson Moon did not abandon the heart. Instead, she gently put it on the tray that had been prepared. Then she took out the dark purple origami's heart, quickly connected the blood vessels, and buried it in Dean's chest. The experiment continued. The whole room was silent. The old men did not even dare to breathe as they stared at this magical scene. They had seen some crazy alchemists do experiments to change the heart, and even the brain, but the process was much more bloody and brutal than this. Naturally, there were countless experimental subjects, but only a few of them succeeded. Even if they succeeded, it did not mean that they would always succeed in the future. This thing depended on probability and luck. After a long time, when Crimson Moon's fingertips lifted from the skin of Dean's chest, the old men came back to their senses as if awakened from a dream. They saw that Dean's chest had been stitched up by silk thread. The silk thread could secrete healing mucus, which would gradually dissolve in body temperature and help the wound heal faster. This was the favorite material for stitching wounds for hunters. Crimson Moon's forehead was full of sweat, not because she was tired, but because she was nervous. She took the towel handed by the old man next to her and wiped it. Seeing that Dean's chest was slightly moving up and down, she was a little relieved. Then she thought of Dean's heart that was lying idle on the side. She was just about to order them to freeze the heart and keep it for future use, but before she could say anything, her face changed. A thick black color emerged from Dean's chest, and the skin on the surface seemed to be dyed black. Moreover, this black color spread like thick ink and gradually spread. Half of his chest was already faintly visible inside, turning blue and purple. At the same time, Dean, who was in a coma, was frowning. His face was full of pain. The two magic marks on his chest and abdomen once again exuded exuberant cold air and boiling heat. Under this abnormal temperature, Dean's skin quickly lost its luster and became very dim, and the epidermis gradually decayed. How could it be? Several old men saw this abnormality, a little shocked and a little nervous. Crimson Moon's face was ugly, and she quickly said, "Check his physical condition." The old men reacted and quickly took out the instruments to check. Soon, all the data were found to be abnormal, either exceeding or lower than the original index, including Dean's heartbeat frequency, which had reached a shocking level. It swelled 3 times per second, and the frequency was getting faster and faster, and the amplitude of the vibration was getting larger and larger. With the naked eye, Dean's chest was shaking violently, and even the metal platform he was lying on seemed to be trembling slightly, as if a heavy punch was hitting it again and again. The force was so great that it was terrifying. Under this violent beating, Dean's chest showed faint signs of tearing, as if the heart inside was about to break out of the shell. "Your Highness, the experimental body will collapse if this continues. He can't bear it any more." Several old men hurriedly looked at Crimson Moon, waiting for her orders. Crimson Moon's face changed, and she fiercely clenched her silver teeth. She reached out and pressed on Dean's chest, growling, "Inject him with nutrients and God's marrow to stabilize his body first. In addition, take out the Arctic worm serum and inject it into him." An old man's eyes widened, and he said in shock, "Your Highness, if we inject the Arctic worm serum, his magic mark of the splitter will transform again. This will not be unbalanced. Do as I say." Crimson Moon fiercely glared at him. If it wasn't for the urgency of the situation and the need for their help, she would have already killed him. The old man trembled under Crimson Moon's glare, and his whole body was drenched in cold sweat. His heart was extremely scared, and he hurriedly nodded, quickly turned around, and ran away. After a moment, several old men took the materials and injected them into Dean's body according to Crimson Moon's instructions. With the injection of nutrients and God's marrow, Dean's body slightly calmed down, but his heart was still beating violently. Even Crimson Moon, who was pressing on Dean's chest, was pushed up and down, and the frequency of her whole body's undulation was already in line with Dean's heartbeat. When the Arctic worm serum was injected, the cold air in Dean's right arm increased, and the cold ice spread to the right half of Dean's chest. But soon, the spreading ice quickly retreated. At this moment, Dean's whole body had turned blue, and the color was gradually darkening. Near his chest and abdomen, and other places had already turned purple, and some places had even turned black. This was not the skin color of a suntanned skin, but a kind of deep black that could absorb light. Thump thump, thump thump. Dean's heartbeat seemed to be faintly coming from his chest, as if there was a sledgehammer hammering the flesh and blood in his chest. Crimson Moon clenched her teeth. She had the most intuitive feeling, and she could feel that what she was pressing seemed to be a desperately struggling life. If it wasn't for her special pupils to see the situation inside, she would even suspect that the origami's heart had evolved into a separate life form. Shortly after the injection of the Arctic worm serum, the slightly calmer heartbeat became vigorous again, and it was even stronger than before. Crimson Moon immediately ordered people to continue the injection. 5 bottles of Arctic worm serum were continuously injected into Dean's body, and the frequency of his heartbeat gradually increased. It seemed that the Arctic worm serum could no longer suppress the strong beating. "Your Highness, this won't do. His body is not compatible at all, and if this goes on, his body will completely decompose." An old man who seemed to have a higher status bit the bullet and said. Crimson Moon clenched her teeth. How could she not know this? But the experiment had already gone to this step. Was she really going to give up like this? At this time, the skin near Dean's chest was rapidly festering. The chest that Crimson Moon was pressing on had already changed from smooth and tough to soft, like mud, and it would collapse with a little force. It still didn't work. She was angry in her heart, but she held it back. She quickly took out the scalpel and cut open Dean's chest. This time, the action was much more violent than before. As soon as the ribs were cut, she saw 2 purple-black tentacles suddenly stretched out from inside, wrapping around her wrist. She was slightly startled, and the next moment, she felt the blood on her wrist quickly rushing out. The purple-black tentacles were like leeches, extending their tiny tip into her wrist and sucking her blood. Her face was ugly, and her palm quickly reached in and quickly broke open Dean's chest. At this moment, she had no time to care about the damage this rough action caused to Dean's body. The latter was already a waste product, and she was only worried about whether she would lose this origami heart. After all, she only had 2 of these things. One was Sylvia's, and the other was the origami that Amelie's tribe worshipped. When the origami heart was pulled out, it had changed greatly. It was no longer the oval shape, but a purple-black ball full of tentacles. It looked like a sea urchin, but the tentacles were longer than the spines on the surface of the sea urchin, and they were soft, constantly swaying as if they had a life of their own. Looking at this strange heart, the old man and Crimson Moon felt a chill. Sylvia had died long ago, but her heart was not dead, and it actually hid such a strong vitality. This was the vitality of a god. Crimson Moon took a deep breath, quickly pulled out the purple-black tentacles wrapped around her wrist, and threw the constantly twisting heart to the old man next to her. "Keep it, seal it." Chapter 1002. After sealing the origami's heart, the old men and Crimson Moon looked at Dean, who was lying on the metal platform. At this moment, his chest was torn open, his ribs were broken, and the tissues in his chest were scattered. Previously, Crimson Moon was in a hurry to take out the origami's heart, so she didn't care about Dean's body, so his body now looked broken, dying, and his vitality was getting weaker and weaker. The experiment failed. The old men's faces were ugly, and they didn't dare to breathe. They also didn't dare to ask Crimson Moon, for fear that she would vent her anger on them. Crimson Moon stared at Dean, who was dying, and was silent. After a long time, she slowly said, "You guys leave first." As if they had been pardoned, they immediately left respectfully. One of them looked at Dean on the metal platform and said cautiously, "Your Highness, since he is already a failed product, we can make use of waste, transform him into an undead, or take out his organs and transfer them to other." "Get out," Crimson Moon said calmly. The man's words stopped abruptly, and he didn't dare to say any more. He bowed his head respectfully and left the laboratory with the others. After they left, only Crimson Moon and the unconscious Dean were left in the laboratory. It was silent. Crimson Moon quietly looked at Dean and suddenly thought of something. She turned her head and glanced at Dean's heart on the tray next to her. At this moment, the heart's beating frequency had slowed down, and it would expand every 4 or 5 seconds. Every time it expanded, a little blood would spurt out from the blood vessels next to the heart. Compared with the heart of the origami, Dean's heart was like heaven and earth. It was only taken out for a short time, but it couldn't hold on anymore. Crimson Moon glanced at Dean's broken chest. The previous movement was too big, so many organs here were damaged, especially the heart. The surrounding tissues were either swallowed and infected by the origami's heart, or torn apart by it. It was impossible to repair in a short time. This man's vitality ended here. The corner of Crimson Moon's mouth slightly moved. If Dean was just a simple experiment, she would have been too lazy to look at him and directly discarded him. But after reading Dean's memory and knowing all his thoughts, Crimson Moon knew how difficult it was for this man to reach today's status and achievements step by step. How much pain and loneliness he had endured. She also knew his dream. When he was young, he longed to be a hero. When he grew up, he hoped to live a peaceful life. Later, he hoped to be able to control his own life, but in the end, he still couldn't do it. How great was this dream, and how petty was it? If the experiment was successful, she would personally help him achieve his dream, but if it failed, failure meant that nothing existed, and everything lost its meaning. You didn't give up in prison. You didn't give up in the face of the splitter. You didn't give up in the face of the unbeatable monster. Unfortunately, your luck is too bad, Crimson Moon whispered to herself. She seemed to be talking to Dean, but also to herself. There was a trace of sadness in her eyes. She slowly bent down, stretched out her slender snow-white hand, and stroked Dean's cheek. Although he was in a coma, Dean's eyebrows were slightly wrinkled. It seemed that there were many troubles gathering on his eyebrows. Crimson Moon felt regret, sympathy, and loss. I wanted to accompany you to become a god, but you didn't live up to expectations. She gently kissed his forehead and sighed. When she lifted her body, the regret on her face had disappeared, and there was a bit of coldness in her eyes. She simply treated the wound on Dean's chest, put the broken internal organs back into place, and sutured the epidermis. Then she called the assistant outside and ordered, "Send it to the freezer, and use it in the future when there is a need." The old men nodded as if they had expected this. The freezer was the place where all the previous valuable failed products were kept, and those that had no further research value were directly abandoned on the corpse mountain. "Your Highness, this heart? Sealed and frozen." "Yes." The old men quickly got busy. They sealed Dean's heart, moved it along with his body, and sent it to an underground freezer at the back of all the laboratories. The temperature in the freezer was extremely low, and it was filled with cold air. It was like a morgue. There were strange corpses lying on the metal beds. Most of them were humanoid, but all of them were incomplete. Some were half human and half beast, and some had a human head, but the whole body was a mass of twisted and strange tissue. The old men found an empty metal bed, lifted Dean on it, and placed him next to the other beds. Then they sent his heart to the back of the freezer, which looked like a safe, and locked it. After that, the old men escaped from the freezer. It was too cold inside, and they felt like their whole body was frozen. The corpses inside were all frozen into popsicles, and it would not be long before Dean would be the same. However, they did not have any pity for the failed product. Failed products were garbage and had no value. Even if Dean used to be the strongest in the wall and ruled Sylvia, but in their eyes, he was just a failed experimental product, and had lost his life, leaving only a body of organs that still had research value. "Your Highness, are we going to use the third experimental product as the final material?" The old men returned to the laboratory and saw Crimson Moon calmly sitting in front of the instrument to test the origami's heart. The third experimental product was the best experimental body they found in the past few months, second only to Dean. He was a witcher, had the ice blood disease, and had awakened his bloodline. But at the moment his head was shaved and his face was haggard as he lay in front of Fei Yu's scalpel. His handsome face was thin and he no longer had the arrogance he once had. There was only loneliness, fear, and despair. "No, don't." The young man's lips trembled slightly. He wanted to beg for mercy, but his voice was already hoarse. Crimson Moon smiled sweetly, and the whole world seemed to brighten up a little. She gently cupped the young man's cheek and whispered, "My dear, believe me, you will become the first god in this world." Tsh. The young man slightly gritted his teeth and squeezed out 2 words from his teeth. The smile on Crimson Moon's face disappeared. She frowned slightly. Suddenly, she found that the method she used on Dean was not applicable to this person. She had already modified his memory. She was the woman he loved the most, the musical talent he had been painstakingly pursuing. But now, in the face of life and death, he had retreated. The oath he had once secretly made seemed as pale and weak as a piece of white paper. It turned out that not all feelings could withstand the test of life and death. She gently sighed and reached out her hand to press his forehead. The young man slightly struggled, but soon his eyes turned white as if he had fainted and his body was stiff. After a moment, when Crimson Moon removed her hand, he still did not wake up. But Crimson Moon did not have the slightest intention to wait. Her expression had returned to coldness. "Prepare the anesthesia." Several old men around knew that the experiment had begun and immediately became alert. They did not doubt that what Crimson Moon said last time was just words of anger. 2 hours later, in the quiet laboratory, only the sound of the instruments colliding could be heard. Crimson Moon and several old men looked dignified as they looked at the young man who had just implanted the heart of the origami. Success or failure depended on this. Puff! Suddenly, a purplish-black limb pierced through the young man's chest. As if it had sensed the figure standing beside the metal platform, it immediately reached out to the nearest old man. The old man was so scared that his face turned pale. He hurriedly retreated, but the purplish-black limb was so fast that it instantly wrapped around his arm. Soon, his arm quickly withered at a speed visible to the naked eye. This withered trend extended from the wrist to the elbow and then the arm. Puff! An old man next to him reacted quickly and waved his knife to cut off the old man's arm. A gray arm that was as dry as skin and bones was like a withered flower stem that had lost its nutrient. It was thrown away by the purplish-black limb and turned around to rush towards Crimson Moon. Crimson Moon's face was gloomy. A silver light flashed between her fingers, and the young man's chest was cut open. The situation inside was horrifying. All the ribs in his chest were gone, and all the organs had disappeared. Only a mass of purplish-black flesh was left inside. Whoosh! Both of Crimson Moon's hands were thrown out at the same time. Silver light flashed on her fingertip. The dark purple flesh in the young man's chest had just extended a few tentacles towards Crimson Moon. Suddenly, the whole mass of flesh bounced up and separated from the young man's chest. Then, it was gently pulled by an invisible force. Bang! It smashed into a huge container that had been prepared for a long time. Click! The lid was sealed. Dong! The dark purple flesh turned over and over in the container. It stretched out its tentacles and slapped the container, shaking it slightly. The old men's faces turned pale. They did not expect that the experiment would fail again. Moreover, the rebound this time was even faster than the last time. Last time, Dean could at least hold on for a while, and the speed of the invasion of the origami's heart was clearly visible. However, this time, such a huge change had occurred just after the implantation. This was the result of the adjustment after half a month of experiment. Could it be due to the difference in physique? Crimson Moon glanced at the origami's heart in the container, and her eyes fell on the young man's chest. After taking out the origami's heart, his chest was empty. Only a layer of skin was left, and the fat layer inside the skin was purple. Obviously, it was infected by the origami's factor. At the moment, the young man had stopped breathing. His expression was frozen with fear. He struggled, and his mouth was slightly open like a statue. Chapter 1004. Clap, clap, clap. At this moment, a burst of applause suddenly rang out. Who was gloating? The old men turned around and glared angrily at the newcomer, but the anger in their eyes was immediately replaced by astonishment. they saw a figure as imposing as a demon god slowly flying in from outside the hall, 12 dark wings gently flapping, curved horns on the top of his head, and a cold face. This appearance was exactly the same as the image of a demon in myths. It was as if he was deliberately fabricated according to the image of a demon. A powerful aura enveloped the entire laboratory, and the old men with average physiques found it difficult to breathe, their eyes filled with shock. Crimson Moon looked at the suddenly approaching figure with a trace of astonishment on her face, but she quickly concealed it. However, it was still noticed by the newcomer, and the smile on his face became even wider. "You're not dead." Crimson Moon's expression was gloomy as she quietly clenched her fists. "It's a bit difficult for the three of them to kill me." The newcomer was Burrow, who was surrounded by the three kings. At this moment, he was smiling as he glanced at Crimson Moon's clenched fists. "My dear daughter, after being away for so long, did you miss your father?" "Father?" The old men were stunned and looked at each other, unable to understand the situation. Crimson Moon spat coldly. "Don't say such disgusting words. How did you find this place? Is there a tracking device on my body?" Burrow smiled faintly. "You really are my smartest daughter. If I hadn't hidden another tracking device in your body, I'm afraid I would have been thrown off by you." Crimson Moon's face showed an as expected expression, her eyes turning as she suddenly said, "This thing is installed in the uranium ring? Smart." Burrow looked at her approvingly, then glanced around the huge laboratory and chuckled. "What, you want to inherit my experiment and complete my god creation plan?" Crimson Moon touched the uranium ring embedded in her neck. She could not remove this thing, otherwise the origami factor would immediately invade her brain and she would lose herself. She took a deep breath and said, "As your daughter, isn't it right to inherit your dream? Unfortunately, you're still a bit lacking." The conditions of this experimental body were good, with an 80% success rate, but you actually failed. Burrow shook his head slightly, expressing regret and disappointment. Fei Yu's eyes narrowed. "You've been here for a long time?" "It's been a while," Burrow said calmly. "What about that idiot you kidnapped earlier?" Crimson Moon frowned slightly. She knew that he was referring to Dean. She didn't know why, but when she heard others insulting Dean, she felt a trace of discomfort, even though the latter was already a waste and worthless in her eyes. "He's already dead. His body couldn't withstand the heart of an origami," Fei Yu said calmly. Burrow grunted, a hint of regret flashing through his eyes as he asked, "What is the reason? You should have experimented many times, right? Why did you still make a mistake? This should be a very low-level mistake. His body is not adaptable enough." Crimson Moon looked at Baluo, who was not in a hurry to attack, and she did not rush to attack either. Although their auras were locked onto each other, on the surface, they appeared to be discussing academic research peacefully like friends. After the origami's heart was implanted, the balance of ice and fire in his body was broken, and he could no longer suppress the power of the origami's heart. Perhaps this heart is too powerful. Before this, I only cared about choosing experimental subjects and neglected to study the power of this heart. It should not be something that an ordinary human can withstand. "Oh? So you're saying that one must become a king to be able to adapt to this heart?" Burrow asked with interest. Fei Yu said indifferently, "Perhaps." "My lady, please." An old man saw that the two were talking about the experiment and did not seem to be enemies, so he immediately said in a flattering tone. Experiment number 3 had failed, and they could be killed by Fei Yu at any time. If they could please this middle-aged man, they might be able to save their lives. However, before he could finish his words, his body suddenly stiffened, and a vertical line appeared on his forehead. Blood slowly gushed out, and then more and more blood gushed out, and his body fell straight to the ground. Behind him, Fei Yu raised her slender little hand, holding a black feather between her fingers. The previous attack seemed to be aimed at the old man, but in reality it was aimed at her. "There are too many noisy ants." Burrow glanced at the black feather that Fei Yu was firmly holding, I haven't seen you for a few months, and your strength has grown quite a bit. Or, did you already have this kind of power? Feiyu let go of the feather and looked at him coldly. Since you're already here, there's no need to say so much. Either you die or I die, but even if I lose, my body will not become your experimental subject. Burrow smiled softly. Whoosh! His body suddenly disappeared, and the next moment, he appeared 1/2 meter in front of Feiyu. He raised his hand and clenched it as fast as lightning. Feiyu's pupils shrank slightly as she looked at the rapidly reaching hand. She felt as if the whole world was shrinking, and her body was being pulled by this giant hand. She fiercely clenched her teeth, and the tip of her tongue bled. The pain stimulated her brain to heat up, and her body abruptly retreated at top speed, instantly putting some distance between her and Burrow. Burrow's eyes moved slightly in surprise. The Abyss Master? Feiyu panted slightly, feeling cold sweat all over her body. She stared at Burrow without saying a word, afraid that her accumulated momentum would be broken by words, so she focused all her attention on Burrow. Your life is bestowed by me, and your strength is bestowed by me. Why would you betray me? Burrow stared at her quietly. The corner of Feiyu's mouth twitched slightly. She knew that Burrow was not deliberately trying to distract her. With the latter's pride, unless it was an extremely poor battle, he would not use such schemes. She adjusted her breathing and said mockingly, My life is bestowed by you, but that doesn't mean you can trample on me at will. My strength is bestowed by you, but that doesn't mean I can't control my own life. Burrow stared at her for a while before slowly nodding. Very well. As soon as he finished speaking, his body disappeared again, leaving only an extremely faint afterimage where he had been standing. Feiyu's pupils shrank, and a panicked expression appeared on her face as she continued to retreat. Whoosh! Burrow's figure was like a cloud of black energy, closing in on her like a shadow. His powerful aura caused her hands and feet to feel cold. Since you won't listen, why don't you destroy? Burrow's eyes were extremely cold and emotionless. He stretched out his large hand, and although it seemed to be moving very slowly, it was actually rapidly approaching Feiyu's throat and strangling her. Pooh! There was a flash of silver light and blood splattered. Feiyu's body stopped moving, and so did Burrow, staring at her in a daze. The panic and despair in Feiyu's eyes disappeared completely, replaced by icy killing intent. The severed hand spun twice in midair before slowly falling to the ground. It was Burrow's hand. Chapter 1005. Whoosh! A white beam of light brushed past Burrow's chin, causing a burning sensation to burn his chin. At the same time, he felt like his nose was bleeding. He reached out and touched it, but all he felt was something sticky. An intense pain came over him, and when he looked down, he saw that his nose was gone, leaving only 2 nostrils. Blood was gushing out from the missing nostrils. What was that? Burrow's pupils shrank. His vision was unable to capture the attack just now, only a remnant white light. The unknown brought fear, and it was no exception to anyone. Crack, crack. Burrow's bones crackled violently, his nails grew longer, and black scales protruded all over his body, covering him like a suit of armor. A silver cross appeared in his eyes, giving him an eerie appearance. When the distance was pulled apart, Boluo carefully swept his eyes over his surroundings. His expression immediately changed slightly. He saw that the walls, pillars, and other places in this great hall were all made of metal, only the surface covered in earth and rock. Meanwhile, the metal pieces inside had 5-centimeter diameter black holes that looked like small hand cannons from the olden era, giving him a sense of danger. You knew I would come? Burrow's face darkened. This was a trap. Crimson Moon stared at him coldly. Do you think I don't know what you've done to the uranium rings? Although you've been very discreet, I've learned a very reasonable saying not long ago: if you don't want others to know, don't do it. Although you're always on guard against me, one of the failed products that you've killed accidentally saw what you've done, and I happened to search their memories when I was dealing with them. No wonder. The silver cross in Burrow's eyes shot out cold killing intent. I knew you were a double-edged sword, but I didn't expect you to be so sharp. You were experimenting here and deliberately lured me here. Did you think you could use these things to defeat me? Crimson Moon said indifferently. I thought you would fall at the hands of the three kings, but I didn't expect you to survive. I was just taking precautions. Fortunately, the Almighty God never treats those who are prepared unfairly. Boluo stared at her, his eyes flickering slightly. Since the latter had predicted that he would come, she was most likely fully prepared. He understood her. She had endured hardships for many years and was a sufficiently cautious person. Naturally, she would not be careless here. Although he believed that with his own strength, it would be very difficult for external objects to threaten him, he was different from other kings. He was familiar with the power of technology. No matter how powerful a king was, they could easily be turned into ashes by a small technological weapon. Even the nuclear weapons of the old era could annihilate all life on the planet. These were all technological weapons that a mere mortal could create. Heh, you want to kill me with just these? You're too naive. Boluo suddenly revealed a cold smile. His body leaning forward slightly, suddenly exerting force, he pounced forward like a phantom. Fei Yu looked at him coldly, not the slightest bit afraid. A beam of white light suddenly shot out from in front of Burrow, striking the place he had just passed. Whoosh, a precise hit, but there was no blood. The struck Burrow's body gradually dissipated, and at the same time, an even faster phantom rapidly retreated, rushing out of the hall. The instantaneous forward charge and reverse flight were extremely seamless, and Fei Yu immediately understood that the latter had only said those words to confuse her. In reality, the attack was just a feint, and the dash had not used his full strength, allowing him to retreat even faster. Whoosh! In the blink of an eye, Boluo's body suddenly stiffened, and he almost stumbled to the ground. At the same time, a dozen or so beams of white light shot out from in front of him. Boluo's mind tightened, and he felt all the blood rushing to his head. At this critical moment, he forcefully stopped his body. Whoosh! The white light passed less than 2 centimeters in front of his body, just a bit more and it would have pierced through his body. In this moment of pause, the hall doors slammed shut, locking up everyone in the laboratory. However, today was the day of the final experiment for test subject number 3, so there were not many staff in the hall, mainly a few old men and a few assistants who followed orders. At this moment, the assistants were standing in the hall, dumbfounded, their faces blank. Electricity. Burrow looked at the place he had just passed. At some point, there was an invisible electromagnetic field in the air, and when he had passed through it, he had been hit by a high-intensity electric current, paralyzing his entire body. If not for his powerful physique, he would have been stuck on the spot, twitching and falling to the ground. You can't get out now, Fei Yu's cold voice came from behind him. Boluo glanced at the tightly shut door before slowly turning his head to look at Crimson Moon. Crimson Moon had already entered her demon form. Sharp spider legs covered in yellow and black patterns grew all over her body. Her upper body was erect, and her cheeks were even whiter than before. She looked even more exquisite, beautiful, and cold than before. She looked like the Spider Queen looking down at him. Burrow noticed that at the edge of her spider leg patterns, there was an extremely fine blood-red pattern that exuded a strange temperature. This detail caused his heart to tremble. The latter could actually infuse energy from other demon bodies while still in the Dream Breeder demon body state. Could this be considered a combination of 2 demon bodies? You seem to know that I would make a move today. Burrow narrowed his eyes slightly. His pupils constricted, and he hurriedly closed his wings to defend himself, but countless rays of white light instantly appeared in his vision, filling up the world of darkness and turning his vision into a vast expanse of white. How? Boluo felt dizzy from the white light, and then the dizziness grew stronger and stronger. He slowly closed his eyes. After an unknown period of time, the black fog gradually dissipated, as if something was attracting it. It gathered on the ground and turned into streams of black gas that surged into the objects on the ground. Crimson Moon's vision slowly recovered, and she looked in the direction where the black gas was surging. Due to the darkness, she could not see what was on the ground, but there were dozens of them of various sizes. 10 minutes later, the black gas was completely devoured by the objects on the ground, revealing the objects that had devoured the black gas. They were lumps of flesh and severed limbs. Crimson Moon breathed a sigh of relief and smiled. She glanced at the wriggling flesh and limbs on the ground, as well as the pierced wing. Clearly, this was Burrow's body. Just 4 or 5 meters in front of her, Burrow's head lay there. His skull had been pierced through from below, and his head had been split in two. However, his brain had not spilled out and was instead stuck to the inside of his skull, still wriggling gently like a wriggling earthworm. Although she had expected this, Crimson Moon still sucked in a light breath and sighed. What kind of tenacious vitality was this? No wonder kings were called existences that had already surpassed humans. However, even if they had surpassed the limits of human life, it did not mean that they could become gods. Thinking of this, a trace of passion flashed in her eyes, and her pursuit of immortality became even more tempted. Your darkness domain may be strong, and with my ability, I can't break it at all, but that doesn't mean that nothing in the world can. Crimson Moon stepped over the severed limbs and flesh around her, and arrived in front of Burrow's head, which had been split in two. Who would have thought that Burrow, who had just displayed his most powerful killing move, would be smashed into pieces in the blink of an eye? This was specially prepared for you. From the moment you stepped into this place, your fate was already decided. Crimson Moon's lips curled up. This was a weapon she had dismantled from the spaceship of Amelie's tribe. Not only did the particle beam it released reach the speed of light, its destructive power far exceeded that of a king's attack. This was the power of technology, and even a king who had evolved to the level of a demon could not withstand it with just his body. On the ground, the eyeballs on the two halves of Burrow's head moved slightly. He looked at Crimson Moon, but there was no resentment or malevolence in his eyes. Instead, they were surprisingly gentle. Half of his lips squirmed slightly, but no sound came out. However, Crimson Moon had read Dean's memories and had already learned how to read lip. When she saw what he said, she frowned slightly. That sentence was, "You've finally grown up." That's right, I have indeed grown up. Crimson Moon was not sure whether he was mocking her or not. Burrow's gaze made her feel uncomfortable and even strange, which was different from what she had imagined. She bent down to hold the two halves of Burrow's head and slowly closed them together. At the same time, one of her fingers turned into a sharp blade and pressed against his forehead, ready to stab into it at any time. At this time, the broken part of Burrow's head made a cracking sound, and the tissues in the skull quickly glued together like countless tiny tentacles, completely filling up the gaps and squeezing out the excess air. The skin on his face also quickly healed, and in the blink of an eye, a complete head appeared. This scene was extremely magical, but Crimson Moon was not surprised at all. She just stared at him, ready to take his life if he made the slightest movement. Although Burrow only had a head left, she was still on full alert. "You're very similar to her," Burrow said slowly. With his head completely restored, his expression was exceptionally calm, even a bit nostalgic. There was a touch of sadness and gentleness in the depths of his eyes that could not be concealed. "Unfortunately, I won't have the chance to resurrect her in this life. If souls in heaven really exist, I hope I can go see her." Crimson Moon looked at him indifferently, knowing who the her he spoke of was. "I am not her, I am me. My new name is Crimson Moon." "Crimson Moon," Burrow murmured, Crimson Moon was born, called Crimson Moon. A trace of bitterness appeared at the corner of his mouth as he sighed softly. Indeed, you are not her. She would never treat me like this, she is more gentle and kind than anyone else. There is no meaning in death. Crimson Moon interrupted him indifferently. Even if I am praised for my greatness after death, it is not as good as trampling all living beings under my feet while I am alive. I only believe in the world I see now. Heaven and hell are just weapons of faith fabricated by the laughable Holy See to discipline mortals. Without ambition, how can mortals fight? Without fear, how can mortals control themselves? Instead of hoping for something so remote, it is better to grasp everything in one's own hands and hold on tight. Burrow was silent for a long time before he slowly said, "You spared my life because you want to use me as your experimental subject?" Crimson Moon's lips curled up slightly, as expected of my good father, the person who understands me the best. You are the best experimental subject I have been looking forward to for a long time. Even the lucky child of the old era cannot compare to your quality. I hope you can give me a pleasant surprise. Burrow's expression had already returned to its cold and emotionless state. If you think you can control me after I become a god, I don't mind becoming the first god of this new world. My dear father, you will become a god. This is your dream, and no matter what, I will help you achieve it. As for now, don't even think about struggling with your broken limbs. Fei Yu grinned, revealing her pearly white teeth that looked a little cold. Chapter 1007. Whoosh. Crimson Moon did not turn around, but flames suddenly swept out from her back and turned into a giant flaming palm that swatted at Boluo's severed limbs and the sharp pieces of flesh that had been deformed into cones. There was a hissing sound as the flaming palm swatted away Boluo's severed limbs as if it was solid, but a few of the sharp pieces of flesh pierced into the palm and bounced off in an instant. The severed limbs that were riddled with scars were now charred black, and the ejected pieces of meat emitted the smell of roasted meat. Crimson Moon smiled, as expected of a former king. Although you killed the extreme ice insect king's consciousness, your body has evolved to the level of a king. Such vitality is almost comparable to them. Burrow's cold expression had already changed. He suddenly opened his mouth, and a long tongue shot out like a viper towards Crimson Moon's face. However, Crimson Moon seemed to have been prepared for this. Just as the bright red tongue was about to lick at her, a vigorous flame surged out of her body and transformed into 4 or 5 slender hands that quickly grabbed the long tongue. The flames seemed to be solid as they tightly pinched the long tongue. A sizzling sound rang out as the flames spread along the long tongue. Burrow let out a miserable scream and fiercely bit off his tongue, causing blood to flow from the corner of his mouth. Crimson Moon tossed the severed tongue to the side with a flick of her hand. She looked down at Boluo from above like a queen who controlled life and death. She said indifferently, "It seems your methods haven't improved after all these years." Burrow stared at her and slowly took a deep breath. Suddenly, a smile of relief appeared on his face. "I knew you wouldn't disappoint me. You no longer need my protection. I hope you can live well." Crimson Moon raised her eyebrows slightly. "What do you mean?" Burrow smiled, his eyes filled with benevolence, without the slightest hint of pain or hostility. Crimson Moon frowned slightly, the corners of her mouth suddenly rising slightly. "Are you trying to say that you're doing this just to nurture me?" Burrow looked at her gently. "I knew long ago that she would not return. Although you are not her, your appearance is hers. All of your genes were extracted from her. In other words, your body is hers. At least, this is enough. Protect this body well. This way, my wish can be considered complete." Crimson Moon fell silent. Boluo's eyes were filled with love as he softly said, "Don't be sad, my body will still accompany you in the future. Just this alone is enough for me to be satisfied." Fei Yu remained silent. Boluo only gently looked at her, no longer saying anything. It was as if he was looking at a child who had finally grown up, filled with reminiscence, sorrow, deep affection, and tender love. After a long time, Crimson Moon raised her head slightly, seemingly awakening from her silent thoughts. Seeing Burrow's expression, she bit her lips slightly, a look of hesitation and entanglement on her face, but just as Burrow was about to speak again, her expression suddenly disappeared and was replaced by a smile, causing Burrow to freeze slightly. "Is this the expression you wanted to see?" Feiyu looked at him with a smile. Boluo's expression changed. "What? You're saying it so affectionately. Are you trying to soften my heart?" Feiyu smiled gently. "What a great story. Playing the bad guy, giving up everything, but in the end dying at the hands of her true love. This can indeed move me. After all, my memories contain her memories. Unfortunately, her memories are only fragments to me. Your understanding of the Dream Breeder's magic marks is only on the surface. How could it compare to my understanding as a magic mark user?" Burrow was stunned, his expression turning ugly. "You deleted her memories?" "Of course not." Feiyu smiled. "This memory is filled with love for you. Although it did not affect my subjective consciousness, it did affect me somewhat, so I was reluctant to do so. I did not delete it, and I know that my reluctance was due to the emotions affected by the memory, but I still did not do so. Sometimes, knowing doesn't mean you can do it. This is probably what feelings are like." "Then why did you betray me?" Burrow seemed relieved, but then he looked at her with eyes full of pain. Feiyu could not help but smile. Crimson Moon could not help but want to laugh. "If you were really the good guy in the story who played the bad guy, I would really be moved, but unfortunately, you are not. You are just a bad guy from head to toe. I know you too well, maybe even better than you know yourself. If your initial obsession was to resurrect her, then later, when you became more and more desperate, your obsession changed. You just want to become a god and satisfy yourself. People always change, and no matter how beautiful your feelings are, no matter how deep your perseverance is, in the face of time and expanding desires, they are as weak as a piece of white paper." "Nonsense!" Burrow roared angrily. Crimson Moon shook her head. "By the time I saw through you, even if she still existed in my memories, I had already lost all love for you. You are not worthy." After saying this, she did not wait for Boluo to speak before stabbing the sharp needle against his forehead. Burrow's face trembled, as if he was dumbfounded, and his eyes rolled back. After a long time, Feiyu suddenly opened her eyes and threw away Burrow's head, as if she had been electrocuted. Her eyes were full of pain, and she squatted down with her hands on her head, letting out a beast-like roar. Dark cold. Dean felt like he was soaking in muddy water. His whole body was soaked in deep water, and he was shivering from the cold. His vision was pitch black, and he could not see the end nor the boundary. There was no time here, but he could feel that a long, long time had passed. This was the world after death? Was he going to wander here for countless years? If so, he would rather his consciousness dissipate. As time passed, the long wait gradually made him feel bored, lonely, painful, and afraid. Just as his mind was about to collapse, he suddenly felt the bone-piercing coldness gradually recede. Not long after, he felt warmth again. This warmth was just a feeling. He couldn't tell where it was because he couldn't feel the existence of his body at all. After a long time, he slowly heard a faint gurgling sound, like the flow of water in a stream. It didn't take long for him to hear a surprised voice coming from far away. He couldn't hear it clearly, but he could hear two words: "Wake up!" At the same time, he saw a ray of light illuminating the darkness. He subconsciously closed his eyes and wanted to raise his hand to block the light. However, the light still shone without any hindrance. At this moment, he felt that the light made him more uncomfortable than the darkness. He had been in the darkness for a long time, and the light had become something that could hurt him. The dazzling light gradually softened. At this time, Dean saw several blurred faces. They were familiar faces: Barton, Noyce, Aurora. Dean was relieved to see them. Noyce loosened his fingers as he pulled Dean's eyelids. Dean slightly turned his eyes and glanced around. He found that the light wasn't strong. It was a dark room. It was similar to the room in the dark fortress where he lived before. He saw a short teenager standing behind Noyce. It was Sangba who helped him to test his body in the laboratory. Sangba was nervous, excited, and happy. He was at a loss as he didn't know where to put his hands. In a flash, Dean understood what had happened. There was a smile on his face. "Did you bring me out?" Noyce and Barton immediately moved aside to let Sangba stand in front of Dean. Sangba was nervous and excited. "Teacher, she had an important experiment today, so she had no time to take care of the freezer. I took the opportunity to secretly transport you out." Dean smiled. "In the blink of an eye, you have grown so big. I almost didn't recognize you at first, Edward." Chapter 1008. Master, we were able to hide in the dark rampart all these years thanks to Sangba. Noyce said respectfully with a smile. "Since you left, we have changed our names." Sangba used this new identity to show his outstanding talent in magic and was trained by the monastery and the Magic Creature Research Institute. He used this to spread a network of relationships, which provided us with a great convenience to do things secretly. They had long gotten used to calling Edward Samba. The name of the past was like a fleeting cloud, forever buried in the darkness. Of course not. My aptitude is poor, and all the divine arts were taught to me by my teacher. I haven't fully comprehended them yet. Sangba scratched his head with a silly smile, his face somewhat red. Dean smiled. Who would have thought that a random student would save his life and give such a big help to Noyce? "There's no end to the invention. You are good enough." Dudian encouraged. Sangba nodded. "There is no end to learning. Teacher, Sangba has always kept your words in mind." Dean nodded as he glanced at his chest. Golden light flashed in his eyes. Everything under his chest was revealed. It was still broken like before he passed out. He sighed as the golden light in his eyes dimmed. He looked at the crowd. "I don't have much time left. I can send you to the kingdom of God or other giant wall before I leave. It is too dangerous for you to stay here. My body is gone, so she will definitely find you. Do you want to go to other giant wall or kingdom of God?" Everyone's eyes widened. Noyce hurriedly said, "Young master, don't be discouraged. We will definitely get through this crisis. In the past, we were able to persevere through dangerous situations. You are the first person to escape from Thorn Flower Prison. What does this mean? The world is so big. Don't tell me there is no place for us?" "Yes, master, you can't give up. Dean, you didn't admit defeat so easily before." Barton and Macon also tried to persuade him. Dean didn't answer. Sangba suddenly thought of something and looked at Dean in surprise. "Teacher, you didn't." After working in the palace for a few months, Sangba had long known that Crimson Moon had the ability to read and modify memories. He had seen several masters of the Monster Research Institute and had their memories read by Crimson Moon. Among them, those who had a rebellious heart had their memories modified by Crimson Moon and become loyal servants. On the eve of the experiment, he also saw Dean and Crimson Moon's intimate appearance. He knew that Dean's memory had been modified. He thought that after waking up, he could use coercive means to keep Dean and slowly help him recover his original memory. He didn't expect that Dean didn't seem to have the intention to look for Crimson Moon immediately. Instead, he took them away. This was clearly hostility. Dean smiled. Her memory has been modified. She did it, but it didn't work. Noyce and the others looked at him and Samba in confusion. They didn't know what they were talking about, but they didn't interrupt. Why? Sangba was also puzzled. He knew how cruel the memory-reading ability was. He had always expressed his loyalty because he was worried that his memory would be read. If his memory was read, Crimson Moon would know his identity. All his calculations would fail, and he would even implicate Dean. He had secretly thought of a way to resist Crimson Moon's ability. But in the end, he couldn't think of a solution. He really couldn't figure out how Dean did it. He could only say that the teacher was the teacher, and his uncle would always be his uncle. A little hypnosis trick. Dean smiled. Memory reading isn't unsolvable. In fact, it has a lot of flaws. Hypnosis is just one of the ways to restrain it. Although she knew that I wanted to hypnotize her when she read my memory, I deliberately passed the memory to her. That is to say, I first hypnotized myself and used the memory as a medium to hypnotize her. When she read my memory, she would trigger the medium and be hypnotized by me. His words were a bit roundabout and light, but Sangba understood it. Moreover, he understood the stakes and the degree of cleverness. His eyes widened as he looked at Dudian in disbelief. Dudian was able to crack this unsolvable ability. The man who used to be a genius and climbed the Wall Lord's position as a civilian had become so powerful and unfathomable. Noyce, Barton, and others barely understood. They looked at Dean in amazement. They didn't expect that Dean could find flaws in such a terrifying enemy. Hypnotize yourself, and then reverse hypnosis. Sangba muttered to himself. Hypnosis wasn't a rare skill, but he didn't think about it in this aspect. Occasionally he had a flash of inspiration, but when he thought about Crimson Moon's ability to read memories, he dismissed the idea. He thought that hypnosis was useless, but Dean took a different approach. He first hypnotized himself and then hypnotized Crimson Moon. If memory was a roll of tape that was played over time, then Dean was folding the roll of tape that was played to yesterday onto today's tape. Therefore, the memory that Crimson Moon saw was from the day before yesterday, and there was no memory of today. This also caused Crimson Moon to be unable to observe Dean's memory from beginning to end according to the process. Otherwise, Dean's step-by-step conception and hypnosis methods would be seen through, and everything would be in vain. Although memory reading is powerful, but it's a double-edged sword. Dudian slowly said, there are many possibilities. If reading memories is a kind of eating, then you should know that anything you eat has the possibility of being poisoned. Hypnosis isn't poison. It's like chewing a grain of sand. It's almost impossible to completely hypnotize her with her willpower. Sangba nodded. He did not dare to believe that Boluo had used his powerful senses to track them down. If he didn't rely on his own ability, could it be positioning? Thinking of the GPS devices hidden on the Shenluo Empire's border guards, Dean increasingly felt that this should be the case. Burrow must have installed a GPS device on either him or Crimson Moon, perhaps both of them. Uranium ring. Dudian immediately thought of the thing under his neck. The only place on his body that could hide the GPS device seemed to be inside the uranium ring. After all, his flesh, bones, and other parts of his body were all checked by X-ray. Everything was normal. Thinking of this, he suddenly felt a chill in his heart. Boluo had their GPS device, but he didn't appear until not long ago. Moreover, he was in the form of 12 wings, which meant that not only had he escaped from the encirclement of the Three Kings, but he was not seriously injured. The other side should have been able to catch up with them long ago, but he had been following them secretly. Perhaps the other side used them as bait and wanted to be the fishermen who would benefit from it. He didn't die even after being encircled by 3 kings. I really underestimated him. Dean slightly clenched his fingers and stared at Sangba. You just said that the person didn't come out? The one who summoned you to do the experiment was Crimson Moon? Are you sure it was her? Sangba was a little nervous under Dean's stare. He said, I just heard about it, but I really didn't see the master, they said. The one who summoned us to do the experiment was indeed Crimson Moon. Is that person your friend, teacher? Dean felt his tension. He knew that his unintentional murderous intent had scared him. There was a trace of apology in his heart, but his expression returned to calm again. We used to be enemies, but now we can be friends. In any case, it's best to stay away from them. But are you sure that it was Crimson Moon who summoned you to do the experiment? Are you sure? Sangba heaved a sigh of relief and said with a bitter smile, Teacher, I can guarantee this. It's absolutely true. It was Crimson Moon who summoned us. Although I haven't spoken to her up close, I can't mistake her appearance. Dean frowned. How is it possible? He couldn't figure out how a cautious person like Boluo would appear without any preparation. The fact that he was able to escape from the hands of the three kings meant that he was definitely an outstanding figure among kings, and he was even stronger than the average king. With this kind of strength, even if he was injured, he would still be able to kill Crimson Moon, and it would be no different from crushing an ant. But now, the one who had disappeared was Boluo, and only Crimson Moon remained. Noise and others looked at each other in dismay. Noise asked in a very low voice, Young master, is this person very strong? Even stronger than the woman called Crimson Moon? Dean looked at him and nodded. He should be one of the best masters in the human world. Even if thousands of wall lords besieged him, they would be easily killed. It's no different from killing insects. Noise and others were dumbfounded. In their minds, the wall lord was as strong as a devil. But in front of that person was so weak? The wall lord wasn't the top of the human pyramid? Did Crimson Moon surrender and work for him again? Dean felt that there must be something he didn't know. He shook his head and looked at Noise. The situation here is more dangerous than I thought. We have to leave as soon as possible. Pack up your things and gather the people you trust. We will leave together. They looked at each other and hesitated. This was their hometown. Although it was not easy to survive here, but in their hearts, the world outside the giant wall was unknown. It was dark and full of dangerous monsters. There was no hope. Dean, do we have to leave here? Mason asked. His eyes were calm. There was no fear or confusion. He just stared at Dean. Is there any other way? For example, we can change our identity and live here. Sylvia is so big. We live in the wilderness near the giant wall. She may not be able to find us even if there are wanted posters. Dean looked at Mason's eyes and immediately understood his mind. He was not afraid of death, but hoped for a more secure solution. It's too dangerous. Dean sighed. Sylvia is big, but if she really wants to find us, then she can easily find us. As long as she finds one of us or someone related to us, she can read our memories and figure out the position of the rest of us. The safest way is to stay away from here. At this point, he sighed again. Originally, you didn't have to leave this place. Her main target is me, but in order to find me, she might find you first. So, it's too dangerous to stay here. Leaving is the only way. Noise, Barton, Aurora and others were silent. In less than 2 seconds, Barton was the first to speak. Dean, I'll go wherever you go. Noise also opened his mouth. My life is yours. No matter where I go, I'm willing to follow you. Aurora said in an indifferent tone. If you give me the ability to avenge my sister, then my life is yours. Even if I have to live outside the giant wall, it doesn't matter. Mason smiled as he heard their words. He was happy for Dean. There were so many people who were willing to use their lives to follow him. Such a man was his brother. He could entrust his life to him. If we leave, then I suggest going to other giant wall. If the woman's experiment is successful, then she will definitely go to a big place like the Kingdom of God. We can go to other giant wall first. Once we have enough strength, then we can go to the Kingdom of God. Mason said. He spoke his own thoughts without any embellishment. He wasn't afraid of Dean's misunderstanding. He believed that Dean could understand his mind. There was a trace of warmth in his eyes. Time would change a lot of things, but it didn't seem to change them. Comfort, laziness, enjoyment, these were the most irresistible things in human nature, but it didn't change their hearts. He suddenly felt very ashamed. Compared to them, he had given too little. This trust made him feel ashamed. Dean's expression didn't change as he said, Then we will go to another giant wall. Before we leave, gather the absolutely loyal people who are willing to follow us. Inform the other brothers who haven't come yet. In addition, prepare the food and medicine needed on the road." "Yes, master." Noyce nodded respectfully. He felt as if he had returned to the invincible days when he listened to Dean's command. "Can we get uranium crystals with the channels in our hands?" Dean asked. Noyce was surprised but soon returned to normal. "Is it the uranium crystal used in the experiment? This thing is rare. If Master needs it, then you can buy some in the underground market, but the quantity is very small. Try to find it no matter how much it costs," Dean said. Chapter 10:10. In less than an hour, Noyce, Barton and others gathered their trusted aides in the new secret stronghold. There were a total of 24 people including Noyce. Dean didn't know most of them, but none of them didn't know him. "Sergei is stationed in the dark barrier of the outer wall. I have sent a message to him, but it may take a while," Noyce said to Dean. Dean nodded. "Is there any news about the uranium crystals?" "It will take some time. I have used all my contacts and intelligence network to collect it. Many people have promised to trade with us. I estimate that it will be around 5 or 6 o'clock in the evening," Noyce replied. Dean took out his pocket watch. It was 2 o'clock in the afternoon. In other words, he would have to wait for 3 or 4 hours. "Let's go to the outer wall and meet up with Sergei. In addition, leave someone here to collect the uranium crystals." Dean got up. He felt dizzy, as if he was suffering from anemia. He paused for a moment but soon recovered. The eyes of the people gathered in the hall were filled with awe. They immediately stepped aside and made way for him. They all lowered their heads and looked at their toes, not daring to look up. Noyce, Barton and other trusted aides of Dean followed behind him. They were surrounded by remote street. There were no pedestrians but a group of black ponies gathered on the side of the street. The horses weren't big. They were almost the same height as a donkey. Even a short woman could sit on them. However, even though these little black horses weren't large in size, they were kings among horses. They were extremely well known, and their names were wolf horses. Wolf horses were flexible, wild, and bloodthirsty. They fed on meat. Even hunters would find it difficult to tame them. They could travel 3,000 miles during the day and 10,000 at night. They could reach a maximum speed of 250 miles per hour. Even outside the giant wall, they could still gallop. Wolf horses were expensive and only sold by the Monster Research Institute. Generally, they were equipped to the masters of the families with high status and background. Dean was surprised to see the wolf horses. He didn't expect that Noyce and others were doing better than he had imagined. "Master, please." Noyce led the way. Dean came to the front of the wolf horses. The wolf horses turned their heads as he approached. They bared their sharp teeth. Their heads looked like those of a wolf and a horse. They were full of murderous aura. If it was an ordinary person, they would have been scared off. Dean turned a blind eye to it and walked straight past. As he got closer, the wolf horses quickly retracted their sharp teeth. They whimpered and retreated, as if they were afraid of something. Dean turned over and sat on the back of a slightly larger wolf horse. The wolf horse's limbs were soft, and it was almost lying down. It kept whining in a low voice. He was standing close to the wolf horse, so he was almost swept away. Fortunately, Dean was relieved. He naturally noticed that he almost hurt Noyce. He felt that the wings on his back were like an extension of his arms. He could control them freely. However, the wings seemed to be different from the past. He wanted to feel it carefully but suddenly thought of something. He looked up and saw Barton, Mason and their confidants looking at him in a daze. "You go first. I'll follow," Dean immediately ordered. Barton, Mason and others recovered and looked at Dean. They didn't ask much and immediately called their confidants to ride the wolf horse. "Master, I'll go first." Noyce looked at Dudian. "Do you know the way?" "I know. Go." Dean smiled. Dean's expression calmed down after Noyce left. He slowly felt the wings on his back. At the same time his mind turned. Soon his body was covered with black scales. In the blink of an eye he entered the demon form. He was like a monster covered with swords. Even his pupils were strange. There was no shadow of a human in his eyes. The demonization was very thorough. Dean slightly raised his hand and waved the blades on his body. He inadvertently drew a trace on the ground. He was surprised to see his body. Splitter's body was very different from before. First of all, the demonization was more thorough. His face still had the outline of a human, but now it was covered by the black armor and sharp blades. It was impossible to distinguish his face. If he turned his body upside down, no one would think that it was his head. In addition, there was a dark golden interlayer at the joints of the demon form. It was a strange material. It was very hard and perfectly protected the flaws of the demon form. Moreover, the process of entering the devil body this time was different from the past. In the past, he first stimulated the power of the devil marks, then stimulated the devil marks, and then combined it with the energy of the demon hunter tool to enter the devil body. But now, he felt that as soon as he thought about it, there was power spreading out from his body, forming the body of the devil body. Then, he felt a clear sense of touch from these bodies, and his nerves were closely connected, and he could control them freely. This feeling was as if the power of the magic marks had completely integrated with his body. He didn't need the magic marks as a medium anymore. In other words, his body had become a huge magic mark. Dean skillfully controlled the demon form. After a moment, he put away the demon form and only revealed the wings on his back. He flapped his wings and instantly flew hundreds of meters into the sky. He turned into a black line and flew straight into the distance. He didn't feel that he was flying fast, but the streets and houses under his feet were rapidly passing by. Even the strong wind was blowing in his face. He couldn't hear any other sounds. A few minutes later, he saw the wall of sighs. He immediately flew up and flew straight toward it. He rose thousands of meters into the sky and crossed the sighing wall. He went straight down and entered the sky above the outer wall. The familiar outer wall had the familiar structure. Commercial district, residential district, and slum district were divided into 3 areas. It seemed more crowded and small compared to the land of the inner wall. The outer wall only occupied 20% of the area of Sylvia. Dean landed in a secluded place in the commercial district. He landed smoothly and raised the dust on the ground. His wings folded and he followed the smell to the front of a magnificent magistrate. It was a branch of the magistrate. There was a group of black ponies in front of the door. There were 2 people sitting on the back of the ponies. Both of them were surprised when they saw Dean. They quickly jumped off the wolf horse and trotted towards him. "Master, you have come." "What about them?" "Lord Noyce and Lord Barton have gone in." Dean nodded. He didn't expect that their second stronghold would be the magistrate of the outer wall. It was a good place. Who would have thought that the dark believers were hiding under the magistrate that symbolized justice and holiness? One couldn't see the darkness in the brightest place because it was covered by the darkness. Dean's eyes flashed as he saw the hidden underground building under the magistrate. He also saw Noyce and Barton leading the team to find Sergei in the underground building. Sergei was still bald, but there were 2 more scars on his face. One of them crossed the bridge of his nose. He was meeting up with Noyce. "I thought that the king has returned, but I didn't expect him to leave." There was a trace of sadness in Dean's eyes as he looked at his old friends in the underground building. He thought that he would either die or return with glory. Who knew that he would end up in such a situation? Dean sighed and silently looked up. He didn't know when he could be like the clouds in the sky, free and unrestrained, no longer rushing around. It didn't take long for Noyce to come out with Sergei and a group of confidants. Sergei knew that Dean had come back. He also knew that Dean had been taken to the palace for experiment. He couldn't help but be surprised to see Dean alive. "Ha ha! I knew you wouldn't die so easily." Sergei laughed. Ha ha. Noyce frowned. What are you talking about? Sergei patted his head. I forgot about it. Master, please don't mind me. Dean waved his hand. Let's go when we are ready. Yes, master. Noyce respectfully nodded. He turned to greet the confidants behind him. The confidants carried out a lot of baggage from the magistrate. They were ready to leave at any time. You're tuning in to the Phoenix Knights YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.